This report by the United Nations Environment Programme was made possible by the generous contributions of the governments of Italy and Switzerland. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Table of Contents. Forward by UNEP's Executive Director. 6. 1. Introduction. 8. 2. Background. 13. 2.1 UNEP's role in post-conflict environmental assessment. 13.2.2 Summary of findings from the Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro missions. 14.2.3 Depleted uranium. 15.2.4 Assessing the risk. 18. 3. UNEP mission. 21. 3.1 Mission objectives. 21 3.2 Composition of the team. 23 3.3 Selection of the sites. 25 3.4 Field work, sampling and laboratory analysis. 25 3.5 IAEA, storage of radioactive waste and depleted uranium residues in BH. 27 3.6 WHO, assessment of the information on cancer in BH. 27. 4. Overall findings. 29. Upstenology. 39. 5. Conclusions. 48. Skoljuxi. 53. 6. Recommendations. 59. Preporuk. 62. 7. Site-specific findings. 66. 7.1 Hatzisi Tank Repair Facility. 66. 7.2 Lukovica. 75. 7.3 Hatzisi Barracks. 78. 7.4 Hatzisi Ammunition Storage Depot. 81. 7.5 Ruska, at self-prop gun. 84. 7.6 Jeljugovici, T-55 tank. 85. 7.7 Hanpijsk artillery storage and barracks. 88. 7.8 Hanpijsk ammunition storage. 97. 7.9 Palkaran barracks. 99. 7.10 Vogoska ammunition production facility. 102. 7.11 Ustakolina, barracks, prison. 107. 7.12 Folka Bridge, Srbinj. 110. 7.13 Kalinovic Water Reservoir. 113. 7.14 Kalinovic Ammunition Destruction Site. 116. 7.15 Bielasnoka Plateau Ammunition Destruction Site. 120. 7.16 The Box of Depenetrators. 123. 4. 4 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Appendix A Risk Assessment. 124. Appendix B Prerequisites and Limitations. 137. Appendix C Methodology and Quality Control. 140. Appendix D Dew in Soil. 168. Appendix E Dew in Water. 185. Appendix F Bioindicators. 193. Appendix G Dew in Air. 204. Appendix H Analysis of penetrators, fragments and jackets. 216. Appendix I Theoretical Assessment of dew resuspension. 221. Appendix J Dew in Surface Deposits and Special Studies on Surfaces. 234. Appendix K Heavy Metals and Other Elements in Selected Water and Soil Samples. 243. Appendix L WHO Assessment of the Information on Cancer in BH. 252. Appendix M Storage of Radioactive Waste and Depleted Uranium Residues in BH. IAEA. 260. Appendix on Military Use of DEW. 266. Appendix O Data on Uranium. 269. Appendix P List of NATO coordinates. 283. Appendix Q Units. 284. Appendix R Glossary. 286. Appendix S References. 293. Appendix T List of contributors. 300. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 5. Forward. In 2001, the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, published the findings from the first ever assessment on the environmental impact of the use of depleted uranium, DU, originating from a real conflict situation. This work was conducted in Kosovo in 2000 and followed up 1 year later in Serbia and Montenegro. Since then, UNEP has become a reference in the scientific community regarding the impacts of DU when used in a conflict situation. When, in the summer of 2002, the Council of Ministers of Bosnia and Herzegovina, B, requested UNEP to conduct a similar assessment in B related to the use of DU ordinance in 1994-95, UNEP was naturally ready to initiate action. In this new study, we learn that more than 7 years after the end of the conflict it is still possible to detect DU in soil and sensitive bioindicators at sites where DU had been used. A large number of contamination points, holes where DU penetrators hit the ground, as well as loose contamination, including DU penetrators, fragments and jackets, casings were found. UNEP could confirm local DU contamination around impact points, although the levels were low and no significant level of radioactivity could be measured. Importantly, for the first time during an assessment in the Balkans, it was possible to detect DU contamination in drinking water. The contamination, however, was very low and remained below the World Health Organization's, WHO, reference value. Finally, DU was also detected in several of the air samples where it had been unexpected to find any DU particles in the air so long after the end of the conflict. Again, detected levels remained below international safety limits. However, for precautionary purposes, confirmation of DU contamination inside some buildings leads UNEP to recommend to the local authorities decontamination and cleanup measures. The mission also analyzed the handling and storage conditions of radioactive sources within BH. The representative from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, provided valuable analysis on these issues. During this challenging work, our cooperation with BH authorities has been excellent. The government shared their scientific and health expertise with UNEP, as well as their important civil protection and mine clearance experience. NATO, SFAR cooperated with UNEP throughout the study, and UNEP, as our local UN partner, helped make this work possible in many ways. All of the scientific members on this mission were experienced from earlier UNEP assessments. I want to congratulate these scientists not only for a work well done, but also for producing new and valuable information on the behavior of DU. Close cooperation with our colleagues from the IAEA and the WHO was a success. Health-related information was 6. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Presented and reviewed by the WHO during meetings with hospitals and government health officials. The WHO assessment, as the competent United Nations agency on health issues, is included in this report. This work could never been conducted in such an efficient manner without the professional work by the National Institutes of Greece, Italy, Russia, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom and the United States, ensuring the highest quality discussion and results. Above all, my gratitude goes to the governments of Italy and Switzerland that provided UNEP with experts, laboratory assistance and generous financial support. Following this third DU assessment in the Balkans, the collective information from these reports can now be used to minimize any health and environmental risks from depleted uranium. These studies confirm that the behavior of DU is a complex issue, and that DU can be found in soil, vegetation, water and air in certain conditions many years after the conflict. For this reason, UNEP strongly encourages further studies in the areas where risks could be higher than in the Balkans. Klaus Topfer, United Nations Under-Secretary General Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 7. Bosnia Ibar. 1. Testera Eneruna. Croatia. Kazan Bihak. Prijetar. Sanski Most. VR Banja Luka. Save. Promjaver. Nagorno Tesinj. Vojvodina a Danube. Save Bijeljina. Belgrade. Mogli. Bosnia and Herzegovina. Jajce. Turbutravnik. Vitezinica. Tuzla Srebrenica. Jablanica. Kiseljak Sarajevo Zepa. Pale. Konjic. Gorajdina. Visegrad. Serbia. Elevation. Itvi Mostar. 2000 meters. 1500 meters. Num. 1000 meters. 500 meters 200 meters 0. Investigated sites. Stolaktribinj. Montenegro. Novi Pazar. 0. 50. 100 kilometers. Podgorica. Copyright Filip Rikaswicz, UNEP Griterendel, 1997. Albania. Introduction. He question on environmental and health impacts originating from the use of depleted uranium, ammunition has, after several conflicts, become a much debated issue. Since there has been very little scientific fieldwork with proper measurements as well as laboratory work outside of the military community, until recently it has been difficult to come to any significant conclusions. In the autumn of 2000, UNEP carried out the first ever international assessment on the environmental behavior of DU following its use in a real conflict situation. In March 2001, UNEP published the report, entitled Depleted Uranium in Kosovo, Post-Conflict Environmental Assessment. To reduce the uncertainties about DU's environmental impacts, a second phase was carried out in Serbia and Montenegro with a field mission in October 2001. This study investigated 6 sites, as well as, for the first time, one targeted military vehicle, which was studied in detail. UNEP subsequently published the report, entitled Depleted Uranium in Serbia and Montenegro, Post-Conflict Environmental Assessment in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in March 2002. In Serbia and Montenegro, authorities had already conducted some decontamination and cleanup operations, which were in line with the findings of the UNEP field studies. Both the Kosovo and the Serbia and Montenegro reports were well received by local stakeholders, as well as by the international scientific community. These reports helped alleviate some of the 8. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Introduction. Public concerns with respect to DU by scientifically demonstrating the low contamination levels and providing recommendations to reduce future risks at affected sites. The request by the Bosnia and Herzegovina authorities to conduct similar studies over 7 years after the use of DU was a new challenge for the scientists in UNEP's team. 15 international experts comprised the UNEP mission to BiH, which took place on October 24, 2002. UNEP had selected 15 sites to be visited during the mission. One of the sites was unfortunately inaccessible due to the heavy presence of mines. For the remaining 14 sites, the presence of mines and other unexploded ordnance, UXO, was a factor that occasionally restricted the work to a degree. 5 of these 15 sites were areas where NATO had reported using DU munitions. The remaining 10 sites were areas where the local population or authorities were concerned that DU might have been used. The possible health risks and questions for safe storage of radioactive waste were integrated into the tasks of this mission. Therefore, experts from the relevant UN agencies, the WHO and the IAEA, participated on this mission. The valuable contributions and recommendations made by these experts are included in this report. Soil sampling at the Kalinovic ammunition destruction site with the remains of an old Turkish fort in the background. A total of 132 samples were collected, 4 penetrators, 46 surface soil, 3 soil profiles of 60 cm, 5 smear, 2 scratch, 19 water, 24 air, and 29 vegetation samples. Both the Swiss Peas Laboratory and the Italian APOT Laboratory conducted sample analyses. Of the 14 sites investigated, 3 clearly showed DU contamination, confirming the earlier use of DU ordnance. These sites correspond to the information on DU targets provided by NATO. 4 new and significant findings are contained within this report. First, detailed laboratory analyses of surface soil samples revealed low levels of localized ground contamination. At most, local ground contamination could be detected around contamination points at distances below 200 meters, but usually much closer. None of the sites showed widespread contamination, meaning a contamination over large surfaces in the range of a couple of hundred meters. Ground surface to contamination detectable by portable beta and gamma radiation detectors was typically limited to areas within 1 to 2 meters of penetrators and localized points of contamination caused by a penetrator impact. Second, penetrators buried near the ground surface and recovered by UNEP had decreased in mass by approximately 25% over 7 years. Based on this finding, correlated with those penetrators studied in UNEP's earlier studies, a DU penetrator can be fully oxidized to corrosion products, for example uranium oxides and carbonates, in 25 to 35 years after impact. Following that, depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 9. 1. Penetrators and fragments fully corrode 25 to 35 years after impact. Time period: no more penetrators, metallic DU, will be found buried in the Balkans soil. In contrast, penetrators lying on the ground surface showed significantly lower corrosion rates. Third, for the first time, DU contamination of drinking water could be found at one site. DU could be clearly identified in one drinking water sample. A second drinking water sample from a well also showed traces of DU, but was detectable only through the use of mass spectrometric measurements. Contamination of the well water may be due to the fact that the well is positioned in what would have been the line of attack by planes. The concentrations are very low and the corresponding radiation doses are insignificant for any health risk. This is also true considering the toxicity of uranium as a heavy metal. However, because the mechanism that governs the contamination of water in a given environment is not known in detail, it is recommended that water sampling and measurements should continue for several years, and that an alternative water source should be used if DU is found in the drinking water. Finally, the presence of DU in air was found at 2 sites, including air and certain surface contamination inside 2 buildings at 2 different sites. Resuspension of DU particles due to wind and/or human activities from sources such as contamination points, corroded penetrators or fragments laying on the surface are the most likely cause. The concentrations were very low and resulting radiation doses are minor and insignificant. However, as some of these buildings are currently under use by the civil population or by military, UNEP considers exposure to such a source unnecessary. Therefore, precautionary decontamination and cleanup steps for these buildings are recommended. In addition to these key findings, some important remarks must also be added. Throughout the mission, the UNEP team observed that workers and civilians, as well as military and mine clearance personnel with access to sites where DU presence was confirmed, were unaware of or misunderstood the risks and issues surrounding DU ammunition. Awareness-raising activities should be considered, including information about DU in general, associated risks, handling and storage and contact information for relevant authorities. A flyer or leaflet, like the ones used to advocate mine safety, could be produced and distributed. 10. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Introduction. The importance of having correct locations and coordinates for DU-affected sites and of obtaining access to these sites for the purpose of conducting surveys and measurements is essential. The longer the elapsed time since the date of the attack, the more difficult it is to implement countermeasures, including decontamination, if necessary. As 6 coordinates of confirmed attack sites are still missing according to the NATO web page, these coordinates should be disclosed without delay. Another important issue related to information on what had happened to the radioactive material that had previously been collected and stored in Bosnia. During the assessment study, UNEP wanted to confirm the whereabouts of a box containing DU penetrators collected earlier from Hadzici. The information received from NATO confirms that NATO, SFA or military authorities have properly stored it outside of B. Online and random survey techniques were used over hard surfaces in Ustikolina. UNEP also visited certain ammunition destruction sites to confirm that DU had not been included among detonated ammunition, as well as to analyze another environmental aspect, the contamination by heavy metals as a result of such destruction activities. Selected water and soil samples were analyzed for their heavy metals content. High surface soil contamination of heavy metals was measured at 3 sites. Such contamination could represent a future health risk. Results indicate that past ammunition production, as well as current ammunition destruction activities, have produced heavy metal contamination of the soil. Ammunition destruction sites should therefore not be situated in areas where secondary contamination could occur, for example, contamination of the groundwater and any animals grazing nearby. Overall, the findings of this study are consistent with the findings of UNEP's earlier DU studies. The levels of DU contamination are not a cause for alarm, but some uncertainty remains with respect to future potential groundwater contamination from penetrator corrosion products. Both general and site-specific recommendations are included in this report for follow-up and implementation. This study is UNEP's third contribution to the scientific debate on the environmental risks and the behavior of DU. UNEP is committed to working with other UN organizations to extend DU studies to other post-conflict regions where the long-term effects of DU contamination should be studied. As part of this commitment, UNEP was invited in spring 2002 by the IAEA to participate in a DU mission to Kuwait. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 11. 1. An air sample operating near Foka Bridge, Srbinj. I would like to extend my genuine thanks and appreciation to all the national and international experts who worked so hard to contribute to the success of this study. All scientists made excellent contributions. I would like to extend my gratitude to 3 in particular. Jan-Olof Sniz, from the Swedish Radiation Protection Authority, SSI, has been the scientific leader of all 3 UNEP DU studies in the Balkans. His role in keeping the scientific quality of these reports at a high level has been exceptional. Gustave Kerblom, also from SSI, has been the technical leader of each mission. Based on his experience, appropriate methods for finding and measuring DU ammunition have been developed by UNEP. Finally, Mario Berger, from SPIE's laboratory in Switzerland, has been a key scientist in all 3 missions in the Balkans and, for the Bosnia and Herzegovina assessment, acted as UNEP's project coordinator. Without their respective dedicated and professional work, the UNEP assessments on depleted uranium would not have been possible. Based on its work in the Balkans, UNEP strongly encourages further assessments to be undertaken in other regions and climate zones where DU has been used in earlier conflicts in order to reduce any uncertainties about its potential environmental impacts in the longer term. Conflicts and wars are never good news. I believe that the findings of this study will contribute both to conflict prevention and to the protection of human health and environment debate during times of conflicts. Pekka Haavisto, Chairman, UNEP Depleted Uranium Assessment Team, Geneva, March 10, 2003. 12. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Background. 2.1 UNEP's role in post-conflict environmental assessment. UNEP's post-conflict assessment unit first emerged in May 1999 as a joint UNEP, UNCHS, Habitat, Balkans task force with the aim of producing an overall assessment of the consequences of the Kosovo conflict on the environment and human settlements. Its particular focus was on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Montenegro and Serbia. As part of this work, an international expert group, the Depleted Uranium Desk Assessment Group, was appointed to assess the potential health and environmental impact of depleted uranium, DU, used in the Kosovo conflict. However, the use of DU in Kosovo had not been officially confirmed at that time and no information was available on the locations of sites possibly targeted by DU munitions. Thus, the work was carried out, inter alia, by collecting background information on the potential effects of DU on human health and/or the environment, the quantity and quality of depleted uranium used in the conflict, and the locations of affected sites. Assessing the medium and long-term potential health and environmental impacts of DU used in the Kosovo conflict by means of a scenario-based desk study. Undertaking a fact-finding mission to Kosovo to make preparations for a possible future sampling campaign, and analyzing information in order to both quantify problems on the ground in potentially affected areas and to provide qualitative answers concerning the possible risks to human health and the environment. The fact-finding mission did not encounter elevated levels of radiation, either in and around the wreckage of destroyed military vehicles, or on, alongside roads. Based on these preliminary measurements, UNEP concluded that there was no evidence or indication of the presence of DU at the locations visited. However, it was stressed that any further investigations could only be meaningful if and when confirmation was received that DU ammunition had been used and, if so, where. Such confirmation arrived in July 2000. Following approaches from the United Nations Secretary-General, NATO made available a detailed list of sites where DU had been used. Operating under the newly formed Balkans unit, UNEP then moved quickly to assemble a team of international experts to prepare a scientific mission to Kosovo from 5 November 19, 2000. In March 2001, UNEP published the findings in the report Depleted Uranium in Kosovo. See Section 2.2 for a summary of these findings. With the continued help of NATO and local authorities, a similar mission to Serbia and Montenegro, FRY, took place from 27 October to November 5, 2001. Building on the Kosovo report, this mission also took air samples in addition to water, soil and lichen samples. The report, Depleted Uranium in Serbia and Montenegro, was published in March 2002, see Section 2.2. Depleted Uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 13. 2. The success of these missions created a need for UNEP to expand its scope beyond the Balkans. In late 2001, the Balkans Unit became the Post-Conflict Assessment Unit, PCA, in order to extend the work to other areas of the world where the natural and human environment has been damaged as a consequence of conflict. In mid-2002, UNEP received an official invitation, this time from Bosnia and Herzegovina, to make a third DU assessment focusing on the use of depleted uranium during air attacks against armored vehicles, tanks and artillery positions in 1994 and 1995. The benefits of this project would also extend beyond the boundaries of B, as important new information would be discovered on the environmental behavior of DU more than 7 years after its use in combat. In order to assess the feasibility and safety of such an assessment so long after the end of the conflict, a fact-finding mission was undertaken from 5 September 14, 2002. Following the success of this undertaking, the third DU assessment mission took place from 12 October 24, 2002. 2.2 Summary of findings from the Kosovo and Serbia, Montenegro missions. In Kosovo, the mission did not find any widespread contamination of the soil or ground surface, though some localized points of contamination were identified at some of the sites where the use of DU had been reported. The major part of ground contamination was found in the upper 10 to 20 centimeters directly below a penetrator. No DU contamination of water or domesticated cow milk was found during the mission and subsequent laboratory testing, and there was no evidence to suggest any immediate health problems. However, it was concluded that there could be future risk of DU contamination of groundwater. Analyses of bioindicators, that is lichen, bark, moss and grass, at 4 sites indicated that DU had been used at these sites, but did not uncover any conclusions about the aerosolization of DU or airborne contamination. In the subsequent Serbia and Montenegro mission, all the sites investigated had previously been visited, cleaned, fenced off and assessed by the FRY authorities. This had not been the case in Kosovo. UNEP could not find any significant contamination of the ground surface or the soil except at localized points of concentrated contamination. 9 penetrators and 13 contamination points were identified. The penetrators were removed and the contamination points marked for later decontamination by the FRY authorities. However, laboratory analyses of soil samples enabled contamination to be detected several meters from contamination points. Dew contamination was found in some soil samples within the fenced areas, that is the target areas. With the exception of K. Parsa, none of the soil samples collected outside the fenced areas showed any dew contamination. Thus, there was no indication that dew had spread outside the fenced areas or over a large distance. Importantly, however, the contamination levels inside the fenced areas were of such a low level that they were considered insignificant from the human health point of view. In terms of groundwater contamination arising either from dew at contamination points or from more widespread ground contamination, the possible consequences in Serbia and Montenegro were insignificant. The general conclusion for the 5 sites investigated in Serbia was that there were no penetrators remaining on the surface in the areas that were searched by UNEP. However, at some sites there were indications that penetrators, and contamination points, were present outside the searched areas and might be present outside the areas fenced off by the FRY authorities in Serbia. There were good reasons for believing that most of the dew rounds fired against targets at the investigated sites did not fragment, but instead entered the ground more or less intact. In this case, the buried penetrators constitute a source of uranium that might, in the future, influence the concentration of uranium in drinking water. During the mission and subsequent laboratory testing, there was no detectable dew in any of the water samples. 14. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Background. 2 of the sites showed a clear indication of dew in the air sampled. However, digging for penetrators was undertaken at the same time as the operation of the filters used for air sampling, making it difficult to find an unequivocal explanation for this finding. As was found in the 2000 Kosovo mission, lichen appeared to be a reliable indicator of airborne dew contamination. Of the lichen samples taken in Serbia and Montenegro, only those obtained from 4 sites showed any significant indication of dew. 2.3 Depleted uranium. What is depleted uranium? Depleted uranium is a byproduct from the process used to enrich natural uranium ore for use as fuel in nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. It is distinguished from natural uranium by differing concentrations of certain uranium isotopes. Natural uranium has a uranium-235, abbreviated as U-235 or 235U, content of 0.7%, whereas the content of U-235 and DU is reduced to about 1/3 of its original content, 0.2–0.3%. The U-235 content in DU used into ammunition in the Balkans was found to be 0.2%, UNEP 2001, UNEP 2002. Like naturally occurring uranium, DU is an unstable, radioactive heavy metal that emits ionizing radiation of 3 types, alpha, beta and gamma. Because of its radioactivity, the amount of uranium in a given sample decreases continuously, but the so-called half-life, the period required for the amount of uranium to be reduced by 50%, is very long, 4.5 billion years in the case of the isotope uranium-238, U-238 or 238U. Therefore, the level of radioactivity does not change significantly over human lifetimes. The unit of measurement for radioactivity is becquerel, BQ, 1 becquerel being the disintegration of 1 atom per second. A heavily corroded penetrator is collected from the soil at Hanpijsk. When uranium decays, another nuclide or isotope is created, which in turn is also radioactive, leading to a long chain of radionuclides, uranium daughter products, being produced. See Appendix O data. On uranium, DU is roughly 40% less radioactive than natural uranium and, consequently, less radiotoxic. This is because during the industrial process by which uranium ore is converted to uranium metal, uranium is chemically separated from all its daughter products beyond U-234, that is, radium, radon and others. In the enrichment process used for the production of nuclear fuel, The uranium concentration of the isotope U-235 is enriched from 0.7% in natural uranium to roughly 4% in the uranium destined for fuel in nuclear reactors. The byproduct is uranium with a lower concentration of U-235, that is depleted uranium, DU. The U-235 concentration in the DU produced is usually 0.2–0.3%. In enrichment plants, U-235, which is slightly lighter in mass than U-238, is used to separate the two isotopes, allowing the enrichment process of U-235. Since U-234 is an even lighter isotope, its concentration is correspondingly higher in fuel uranium and lower in DU when compared with natural uranium. The fact that DU has depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 15. 2. Lower concentrations of U-235 and U-234 than natural uranium also explains why DU is less radioactive than natural uranium. Data on the specific activity of DU are given in Table 2.1. Table 2.1 Depleted uranium, DU, 235 U 0.2%, 238 U 99.8%. Isotope U-238 U-235 U-234 Th 234 pascals to 234 meters Th 231 DU ammunition. 1. Brown et al., 1986. Chemical composition 199.7990% 0.2000% 0.0010%. Traces, decay product, traces, decay product, traces, decay product. Sum. Specific activity, BQ/mg DU. 12.38 0.16 2.29 12.27 12.27 0.16 39.42. Uranium occurs naturally in all rock, soil, water and beta. The typical concentration of activity, expressed as specific activity, activity per mass unit, of U-238 in the Earth's crust is 5 to 125 becquerels per kilogram. BQ/kg, equivalent to 0.5 to 10 mg/kg, 1 mg/kg equals 1 part per million equals 1 gram/ton. Typical values for U-235 are around 0.2 to 5 becquerels/kg. The specific activity of U-238 in uranium ore of good quality, 0.5 to 30% uranium, is 0.6 mg/105 to 3.6 mg/106 becquerels/kg. The specific activity of pure uranium metal and radioactive equilibrium with its immediate decay products is 50.23 mg/106 becquerels/kg, 50.23 becquerels/mg/Na2. Details on the specific activity of uranium in soils, rocks, water and air are given in Appendix O, Tables O.18 and O.19. The overwhelming part of the radiation emitted from the nuclides in the U-238 series is emitted from the isotopes that follow after U-234. Compared with the sum of the energy of alpha radiation emitted per transformation from all isotopes in the U-238 series, the isotopes that follow after U-234 emit about 89% of the alpha energy, roughly 58% of the beta radiation energy and about 98.6% of the gamma radiation energy. Appendix O, Table O.4. Beta radiation is measured from a penetrator fragment found in the concrete at Hatsisi. If reprocessed uranium from a nuclear reactor is used, fully or partially, as feed material in the enrichment process of uranium, or if this was the case during earlier runs of the technical facilities of the enrichment plant, the DU may contain tiny traces of fission products, uranium isotopes and transuranic elements that are specific to reprocessed reactor fuel. In DU penetrator material found during earlier UNEP missions to the Balkans region, UNEP, 2001, UNEP, 2002. Traces of U-236 and Pu-239-240 could be identified. U-236 was analyzed around 0.003%, mass percent, and Pu-239-240 contamination of the DU was around 20 becquerels/kg, 10 micrograms per kilogram, which is equivalent to the very low content of 1 plutonium atom per 100 billion uranium atoms. This indicates that the DU found in the 16 post-conflict environmental assessment. Background: Balkans came into contact with reprocessed uranium at some point during its fabrication process. The concentration of contaminating nuclides is indeed so low that their contribution to the total radiation dose of DU is insignificant and can be neglected in assessing a risk to humans or the environment. Uranium occurs naturally in the +2, +3, +4, +5, and +6 valence states, but it is most commonly found in the hexavalent form at the Earth's surface. In nature, hexavalent uranium is commonly associated with oxygen as the uranyl ion, UO22+. The different uranium isotopes are chemically identical and thus exert the same chemical and toxicological effects. Metallic DU reacts chemically in the same manner as metallic uranium, which is considered to be a reactive material. The general chemical character of uranium is that of a strong reducing agent, particularly in aqueous systems. In air at room temperature, solid uranium metal oxidizes slowly and first assumes a golden yellow color. As oxidation proceeds, the color darkens and at the end of 3 to 4 weeks, the metal appears black. Blask et al., 1970. Metallic DU, particularly as a powder, is a pyrophore, which means that it spontaneously ignites in air at temperatures of 600 to 700 degrees Celsius. When DU burns, the high temperatures oxidize the uranium metal to a series of complex oxides, predominantly triuranium octoxide, U3O8, but also uranium dioxide, UO2, and uranium trioxide, UO3, Rand, 1999. Upon oxidation, uranium metal first forms UO2. A typical oxidation rate for massive uranium metal would be penetrations of 0.005 mm/day, 0.19 mg/cm2 per day, at 175 degrees Celsius. Significant oxidation of UO2 does not occur except at temperatures above 275 degrees Celsius, Benelick, 1966. Uranium oxides are sparingly soluble in water but in a moist environment will gradually form hydrated oxides. Under such conditions, the addition of 0.75% titanium to DU metal used in penetrators appears to slow the oxidation rate by approximately a factor of 16, Erickson, 1990. Microbial action can speed the corrosion rate of uranium. The corrosion rate is controlled by several variables, including the oxygen content, presence of water, size of metal particles, presence of protective coatings and the salinity of any water present. The principal factor controlling corrosion is the size of the particles and hence, surface area. Thus, small particles of uranium metal, produced by abrasion and fragmentation, corrode rapidly, whereas large masses of uranium metal usually corrode very slowly. In the long term, all uranium metal will oxidize to U4+ and U6+, US EPI, 1994. Studies carried out on penetrators collected by the UNEP DU mission to Kosovo in 2000 shows that impact on the ground causes numerous fine cracks in penetrators, UNEP, 2001. This favors increased rates of corrosion and dissolution. Rapid corrosion was further confirmed by studies made on penetrators collected during the 2001 UNEP mission to Serbia and Montenegro, UNEP, 2002. DU can expose people to radiation both from the outside, external radiation, and from the inside, internal radiation, if DU enters the body by inhalation or ingestion. The harmful effect of such radiation is mainly an increased risk of cancer, with the magnitude of risk depending on the part of the body exposed, particularly exposure of the lungs through the inhalation of insoluble compounds, and on the radiation dose. Like naturally occurring uranium and other heavy metals, DU is also chemically toxic. The toxic effect depends on the amount ingested by the body and the chemical composition of the uranium. Depleted uranium's toxicity is normally the dominant risk factor to consider in the case of ingestion. For complete, specific data on uranium and depleted uranium, see Appendix O. The military uses of DU are summarized in Appendix N. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 17. 2. 2.4 Assessing the risks. The concept of risk, its meaning and application are discussed in detail in Appendix A. Risk Assessment. The following is a summary, intended to equip readers with the necessary background for interpreting the overall findings, conclusions and recommendations presented respectively in Chapters 4, 5 and 6 of this report. Line surveys with field instruments were undertaken at all sites during the mission. Risk can either refer to the probability, sometimes possibility of occurrence of a given event, or to the consequences of an event if it occurs. A third possibility is a combination of both probability and consequence. Regardless of how the term is used, it is clear that scientific quantification of a given risk has to be expressed clearly and concisely so that appropriate judgments and responses can be made. The effects of being exposed to DU are both radiological, that is due to radiation, and chemical, that is as a result of biochemical effects in the human body. Corresponding health consequences may, depending upon the dose or intake, include cancer and malfunction of body organs, particularly the kidneys. In order to avoid consequences developing from day-to-day procedures in which radioactive and toxic materials are used, a range of applicable standards have been established, including limits for exposure to radiation and toxic materials. However, although such limits and standards exist, these do not imply that if these values are surpassed that there will automatically be severe or adverse consequences, such as serious illness. Wide safety margins are built in before any unconditional or high probability of serious illness could occur. Nonetheless, from a safety point of view, such a situation would be unacceptable. A potential way to judge the consequences of events or circumstances where DU exposure may have occurred is to compare findings, measurements or assessments with natural levels, and with given safety limits or standards. See Appendix O. In this report, the consequences are those that might be caused by intake of DU through ingestion or inhalation and/or through external radiation exposure to DU. The consequences of radiation may be expressed directly in terms of the radiation dose, which is measured in millisieverts, MSV, or microsieverts, microsieverts. Comparisons can be made with natural levels and with established limits and action levels. Consequences of radiation, in this report, are considered insignificant for doses less than 1 millisievert per year, or per 18. 18 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Background. Infrequent event, and significant for doses higher than 1 millisievert. Because there is an assumption of a linear non-threshold relationship for biologically detrimental effects of ionizing radiation, there is also a decreasing probability of occurrence with decreasing radiation doses. Therefore, an insignificant radiation dose means, in reality, a low and insignificant probability of getting a serious illness from that dose as compared with the overall probability of contracting that same illness from all other potential sources. With respect to chemical toxicity, consequences are treated as insignificant in this report for concentrations or total intakes below applicable health standards or guidelines, and significant for those above. In the site-specific findings in Chapter 7, judgments of risk are made on the basis of measured DU ground contamination and measurements of possible DU contamination of drinking water and air. The relationship between measurements and risks are discussed in Appendix A. Risk Assessment. There is also a summary of risk assessment in relation to a given situation, known as the reference case and taken from the 1999 UNEP DU Risk Assessment Report. This assumes ground surface contamination of 10 grams DU per square meter, hereafter referred to as the reference level. The presence of minefields prevented full access to the site in Herzegovina. Some levels of exposure lead to significant risks, consequences, radiation doses, intakes, as compared with chemical toxicity standards, others to insignificant risks. If ground contamination is less than 0.1 to 1 gram/m2, the consequences are normally insignificant. In the current report, the risks considered and assessed, in terms of significance or insignificance of consequences for the environment and human health, are the following. If there is widespread measurable contamination of the ground surface by dew, there is a risk that some dew will become airborne through wind action and subsequently be inhaled by people. There is also a possibility of contamination of food, fruit, vegetables, meat, etc., and drinking water. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 19. 2. If there are localized points of concentrated contamination, referred to in this report as contamination points, there is a risk of contamination of hands and/or of direct ingestion of contaminated soil. There is also a possible risk of airborne contamination and contamination of drinking water. Solid pieces of dew lying on the ground surface, either fragments of or complete penetrators, can be picked up by persons completely unaware that they are handling uranium. Consequently, there is a risk of being exposed to external beta radiation and to internal radiation, that is from inside the body, if corroded dew dust or dew fragments enter the body. A large percentage of dew rounds that hit soft targets, or miss the intended target completely, will have penetrated into the ground and become corroded over time, to a widely varying degree, depending on site-specific environmental conditions. As a result, there is a risk of future contamination of groundwater and nearby wells used to supply drinking water. There is also a risk that dew fragments will be brought up to the surface through reconstruction activities. As more than 7 years had elapsed since the attacks with dew munitions in BiH 1994 to 1995, the conditions influencing the environmental consequences have changed and, thereby, the risks to people. For instance, the risks of airborne contamination from resuspension of dew dust on the ground surface should decrease over time due to the expected dispersion into the ground by dissolution in water, as well as an increasing cover of grass, leaves, etc. On the other hand, and for the same reasons, the probability of water contamination increases over time as dew from surface dust and corroded penetrators enters the water table. Furthermore, over the aforementioned 7-year period, people may have been exposed to any of the risks described in Appendix A. The possible health consequences of such exposures need to be taken into account by the relevant competent bodies within BiH. The risks of contamination from touching a penetrator on the ground increase, given the possibility of hands or clothes becoming contaminated by corroded dew and the risk of subsequent internal contamination through ingestion. However, this increased risk may be offset by the decreased probability of finding a penetrator that is hidden by vegetation. In conclusion, and as discussed in further detail in Appendix A, the overall risks from dew decrease with time. Waters were collected from various sources. 20. Post-conflict environmental assessment. UNEP mission. 3.1 Mission objectives. Since UNEP's first depleted uranium, DU, mission to Kosovo in November 2000, a great deal of experience has been gathered concerning the behavior of DU in the natural environment. A variety of international studies covering such behavior, as well as medical aspects and risks, have been published in key documents on DU, National Research Center for Environment and Health, GESF, Germany, January 2001, World Health Organization, WHO, Geneva, April 2001, the Royal Society UK, May 2001 and 2002, Italian Ministry of Defense Italy, May 2001, Scientific and Technological Options Assessment Series, STA, 105 2001, May 2001, Swedish Defence Research Agency, FOI, Sweden, August 2001. What made this mission distinctive from the 2 previous missions was that a significantly longer period of time, 7 years, had elapsed between the end of the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, BiH, and the DU assessment. During this time, it could be expected that environmental contamination from DU had probably altered in both quantity and quality owing to natural processes. The objectives of the present mission can be summarized as follows. The most important objective was to examine the possible risks from any remaining dew contamination of ground, water, air and beta, as well as from solid pieces of dew, that is intact or fragmented penetrators, still in the environment, and on that basis recommend any justified countermeasures. The measurements of beta focused, as in the earlier UNEP dew studies, on bioindicators such as lichens, bark, mushrooms and mosses in order to study their use as fingerprints of earlier dew dispersion in air. A second objective involved comparing the measurement results with those published by various expert groups, see above, as well as in UNEP's previous assessment reports, and thereby improve UNEP's earlier conclusions with these data. Of particular interest was the long-term behavior of dew in the national environment and the conclusions that might be drawn on the corresponding long-term risks of dew. These conclusions would also be applicable to other places with similar environmental properties and where dew has likewise been used. Thirdly, UNEP wanted to gain an overview on the storage of radioactive waste and sources, as well as radioactive waste management within the country in general. This task was undertaken by the IAEA representative of the UNEP team and is reported in Appendix M. Storage of radioactive waste and depleted uranium residues in Bosnia and Herzegovina. An important final objective was to obtain an indication of the current level of any existing health databases, both in general and specifically with respect to any population which was expected or rumored to have been exposed to dew at the time of conflict, that is dew dust during an attack. This assignment was undertaken by the medical sub-team comprised of health experts from the WHO and the U.S. Army Center for Health Promotion and Preventive Medicine and is reported in Appendix L. WHO Assessment of the Information on Cancer in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 3. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 21. 3. Key questions facing the UNEP mission were: 1. What are the present levels of dew contamination in the area, over 7 years after the firing of dew ammunition? 2. What are the corresponding radiological and chemical risks, both now and in the future? 3. Is there any need for remedial measures or restrictions? 4. If so, which measures are reasonable and realistic? The UNEP team received a briefing at each site prior to starting their investigations. The operational objectives and scope of the mission were aimed to answer these questions while bearing in mind, I, the conclusions and recommendations of the October 1999 UNEP dew dust assessment, 2, the results and recommendations of the 2 previous UNEP dew missions, 3, the possible constraints on the mission, and 4, the need to conduct the mission in a scientifically sound manner in order to achieve results of high quality. These conditions and prerequisites are developed further in Appendix B. Prerequisites and Limitations. Specifically, the operational objectives and scope of the mission were: to confirm the presence or absence of dew at selected, confirmed locations, to determine the distribution of solid pieces of dew, penetrators, fragments, jackets, in the environment and other localized, concentrated, points of contamination, called contamination points or hotspots, at the investigated sites. To determine how widespread any potential contamination of soil, water, biota etc. is at the investigated sites. To determine the possible presence of dew dust in air caused by resuspension of dew from the ground. To determine the corrosion status of penetrators, to determine the depth distribution of dew corrosion products beyond a penetrator by studying soil cores. To determine the precise isotopic composition of penetrators/fragments, to assess the corresponding risks from dew, to judge the necessity of establishing precautionary measures, to gain experience with regard to the possibilities and limitations that need to be taken into account when planning and executing dew missions in the future. To draw conclusions and recommend possible follow-up activities, and to inform concerned parties. Of additional interest, UNEP also sought to determine possible, non-radioactive, heavy metal, for example lead, concentrations in selected water and soil samples. 22. 22 Post-conflict environmental assessment. UNEP mission. A total of 11 sites known to be attacked in 1994-1995 by 8-10 planes using 30mm DU ammunition was published by NATO. See Appendix P. 5 of these sites were available with the exact coordinates and were subject to UNEP's field investigation, whereas the exact positions of the other sites remain undisclosed. The other sites chosen for investigation during the field mission were done on the basis of the NATO document CM 2001-43, in combination with local information and rumors about sites, as well as UNEP fact-finding pre-mission, see Section 3.3 below. Since 1999, significant efforts have been undertaken in the Balkans region by international expert teams with NATO support in order to localize and measure contamination from DU on the ground. The outcome of NATO's efforts is published on their website, www.nato.in/doc/do105223b.pdf, tables in Annex 2 to NATO Unclassified Document CM 2001-43. Those teams covered a range of sites that stood under SFOR troop jurisdiction. Dose rate measurements were conducted and, in some cases, different environmental samples such as soil and water were taken. These were analyzed in detail mainly by gamma spectrometric measurements and other chemical parameters. The teams essentially detected no risk from DU at the sites. Some of the previously examined sites were also subject to the UNEP assessment presented here. NATO had previously been involved in limited cleanup activity at an unspecified time to remove loose DU contamination, that is penetrators and jackets, from the ground surface at one of the sites visited during the UNEP mission, the former Hadsisi tank repair facility. The penetrators and jackets were removed and placed within a box, which was photographed by the press and published worldwide prior to being removed from the area. See www.nato.in/index/105/S105P03A/T01012438.htm. 3.2 Composition of the team. The UNEP DU mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina was undertaken by an 18-member team, most of whom were involved in the 2 earlier UNEP DU assessments. Experts came from UNEP, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the Swedish Radiation Protection Authority, SSI, the United States Army Center for Health Promotion and Preventive Medicine, USASP, the Nuclear Safety Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Greek Atomic Energy Commission, WHO, the University of Bristol, UK, and 2 national laboratories, the Swiss SPIES Laboratory and the Italian Environmental Protection Agency and Technical Services, APOT. The WHO health expert did not visit any of the sites, but was involved with meeting government health officials and local hospital representatives. Due to the heavy mine and unexploded ordnance situation, a security expert, formerly of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, advised the team throughout the mission. The UNEP team ready to embark on a day in the field. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 23. 3. The remaining team members comprised UNEP's co-chairman, the DU assessment project coordinator, the report writer and a project assistant. The composition of the team was mainly determined by the need for diverse technical experience and competence in order to ensure suitably qualified, scientific and wide-ranging examination of the DU issue. It was also necessary to have members with appropriate positions of seniority for conducting negotiations with the military and administrative authorities during the mission. For that purpose the team included the following functions and expertise: Team leader, project coordinator, scientific leader, technical leader, safety and security expert, experts in the fields of health and environmental effects of depleted uranium, radiation protection, equipment use and maintenance, surveying and field measurements, sampling, air, beta, water and soil, laboratory work, military advice, mapping, logistics, reporting, public relations. In practice, one person was often able to cover several tasks and areas of expertise so that 2 or more experts dealt with a number of subjects. Beta radiation measurements during the pre-mission helped identify contamination spots. 24. Post-conflict environmental assessment. UNEP mission. 3.3 Selection of sites. A fact-finding pre-mission, held on 5 September 14, 2002, looked at 18 sites based on information provided by local authorities, NATO, and research. This included information published on the NATO website indicating positions targeted by DU munitions, together with dates of firing and the numbers of rounds used. The final choice of which sites, targeted or rumored, were to be investigated was made solely and independently by UNEP. 11 sites from the pre-mission were retained for investigation during the full DU assessment. They were selected on the basis of preliminary indications of DU munitions use and information provided by local authorities, as well as rumored bombing sites. Shortly before the October mission, NATO provided UNEP with 2 additional site coordinates for confirmed DU attacks. These sites were added for investigation and assessment, for a total of 5 NATO-confirmed sites to be investigated. With additional information acquired from local authorities throughout the course of the October mission, 2 further sites were included for investigation. These sites involved ammunition destruction and could have been contaminated by DU if the ammunition had been inadvertently destroyed in such areas. UNEP also asked the authorities whether any vehicles hit by DU could be investigated, but none could be located. Within each the study area, a more detailed selection of specific sites suitable for investigation was made in situ, based mainly on instructions from military experts and UNEP's security advisor concerning I, the presence of mines and unexploded ordnance, and 2, estimates of the probable direction of attack. The criteria for selecting sites were as follows. The approximate number of DU rounds fired was known. Indications of a DU attack were identified during the pre-mission. Information and rumored information were supplied by local authorities. The sites taken together were representative of a range of environmental conditions and properties. The locations taken together were representative of the region's varied ethnic composition. The areas to be examined were considered safe from mines and unexploded ordnance. The areas were close to residential areas and needed to be investigated for humanitarian reasons. 3.4 Field work, sampling and laboratory analysis. The mission used 5 complementary technical methods in conducting its investigations. Field measurements of beta radiation, total beta, field measurements of gamma radiation, total gamma, field sampling of soil, water and vegetation, bioindicators, with subsequent laboratory analysis, field air sampling by special air filter samplers, with subsequent laboratory analysis, and field analysis of higher radioactive background levels, gamma spectrometric measure. MENTs, for example from lightning rods, cesium-137 fallout from the 1986 Chernobyl accident, natural radiation. The surveys of radiation in the environment were made using beta and gamma instruments held close to the ground, usually employing the lineup survey technique. This technique involved team members walking several abreast at fixed distances from each other, and sometimes along parallel transect lines. See Appendix C for a full description. As a complement to these formal searches, individual survey measurements were made. Although carried out in a more random way than the lineup surveys, likely search areas were selected by observing the assumed direction of attack and looking for signs of ammunition impacts. These individual surveys were often very effective. The results of field measurements of radioactivity are given as counts per second, CPS, or microsieverts per hour, abbreviated as microsieverts/H. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 25. 3. Each measurement taken was governed by uncertainties that had to be estimated. Besides the usual statistical uncertainties, there are possible systematic errors in the field measurements caused by absorption of the radiation, and in laboratory work by varying analytical techniques used. Analyses of soil, soil cores, water, biological and air samples were carried out at both the SPIS and APOT laboratories. Starting a lineup survey at Jeljugovici. Following the Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro missions, a quality control exercise for selected IAEA certified reference materials was conducted. Both SPIS and APOT laboratories passed that quality control test. The reference materials IAEA 326, soil, IAEA 336, lichen, IAEA 140 TM, seaweed, and IAEA 381, seawater, were analyzed, with the results reported in Appendix C methodology and quality control. The analysis of penetrators was performed solely at SPIS laboratory. The results of laboratory samples, of soil and beta, are given either in terms of weight, that is milligrams of uranium isotope, U-238 etc., per kilogram of sample, abbreviated as MGU, kg sample, with DU expressed as a percentage of total uranium concentration, or in terms of activity in becquerels per kilogram, BQ, kg. Field instruments effectively detected increased gamma radiation. For water samples, results are given as micrograms per liter, micrograms/L, or microbecquerels per kilogram, microbecquerels/kg, and for air in microbecquerels/m3. Specific components of the measurement and sampling campaign included field measurements using beta instruments, sometimes in combination with gamma instruments to identify strong hidden contamination or hidden penetrators, held close to the ground to search for possible widespread DU contamination and contamination points. Field measurements using a gamma instrument held close to the ground to find DU penetrators and jackets, casings lying on or close to the surface. Field measurements using a gamma spectrometric instrument placed close to objects of interest. Sampling of soil from around and beneath penetrators and contamination points, in order to study the migration of DU in soil. Sampling of soil from the wider environment to search for possible widespread DU contamination, complement to the field measurements. 26. Post-conflict environmental assessment. UNEP mission. Sampling of water from both streams and reservoirs, tap water, to search for possible DU contamination of water supplies. Sampling of beta, for example lichen, bark, mushrooms and moss, in order to check for the possible presence of DU as evidence of earlier or ongoing contamination. Sampling of air at several locations within most sites. The number of samples taken at each site, the number of penetrators and jackets found, and the approximate number of DU rounds fired against the respective site are given in Table 3.1. Retrieving a penetrator embedded in cobblestone at Hatsisi. The results of all the laboratory analyses are given in detail in Appendices D, E, F, G and H. The geographical, UTM, coordinates of each sampling position can be found in Chapter 7, together with corresponding maps. The analytical methods used are fully described in Appendix C. 3.5 IAEA, Storage of Radioactive Waste and Depleted Uranium Residues in Bosnia and Herzegovina. One of the tasks assigned to the UNEP team for this mission was to conduct an investigation of the regulatory and technical infrastructure the country has in place concerning the storage of radioactive waste and, in particular, DU residues. As part of this task, the IAEA representative, accompanied by an UNEP team member, carried out a series of meetings with national authorities and visited the interim low-level radioactive waste storage facility of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, FB. Appendix M describes the outcome of this investigation. 3.6 WHO Assessment of the Information on Cancer in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The WHO developed an assessment on the information on cancer due to DU exposure, as well as cancer rates in general, in BE. A health consultant to UNEP, coming from the U.S. Army Center for Health Promotion and Preventive Medicine, USASP, accompanied the WHO in the visits and meetings. Visits were made to the cities of Sarajevo, in both the FB and Republika Srpska, RS, and Banja Luka. See Appendix L for the report. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 27. 3. Table 3.1 Summary of samples collected and on-site findings in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Site name. Hadzisi tank repair. Air. Water. Sample type, collected, botanical soil smear. Fragments/penetrators. Penetrators found on the surface. Contamination points found. Rounds 9, 4, 7, 12, 1. Yes. 240. 1500. Lukovica. 4. 1. 5. 4. No. No. Unknown. Hadzisi Barracks 2. 2. 1. 3. No. No. Unknown. Hadzisi. Ammunition. Storage. 76 mm self-prop at gun, Roska. Jeljugovici, T-55, dash. Hanpajsk Barracks. 6. 2. Hanpajsk. Ammunition. Storage. Palkaran Barracks. 1. Vogoska Ammunition Production. 2. 2. Ustikalina Barracks. 2. Foka, Srbinj, Bridge. 1. 1. Kalinovic Water Reservoir. 1. Kalinovic. Ammunition. 1. Destruction Site. Bielaznuka. Plateau Ammunition. 2. Destruction Site. 2. 2. Unable to access. 2. 2. 4. 6, plus 3 soil 4, plus 2 coarse, scratch. 3. 2. 4. 5. 1. 1. 3. 1. 2. 1. 1. 2. 1. 2. Yes. 6. 1500. 860. No. 2, caused by cesium 137. 120. Yes. 48, plus 1 caused by cesium 137. 2400. No. No. Unknown. No. 6, caused by cesium 137. Unknown. No. No. 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 Total. 2419. 29. 46, plus 3, 5, plus 2. 4. Additional smear samples were taken by the Russian expert as part of a special study on surface contamination. Results are discussed in Appendix J. Storage boxes for samples collected during the mission. 28. 28 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Overall findings. 4.1 Overview. The following sites were investigated during the mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina. B. The former Hadzisi tank repair facility, Lukovica, Hadzisi Army Barracks, the former Hadzisi ammunition storage depot, a hill at Jeljugovici, site of a T-55 tank, the Hanpajsk artillery storage and barracks, the Hanpajsk storage area, Palskaran Barracks, Vogoska's former ammunition production facility, a barracks site in Ustikalina, a bridge in the town of Foka, Srbinj, a water reservoir site in Kalinovic, the Kalinovic ammunition destruction site, and the Bielaznuka Plateau ammunition destruction site. The sites were chosen for investigation based on information which was provided stating that depleted uranium had probably been used or that certain areas could have a potential risk of contamination due to other activities. DU was found at 3 of these sites, the former tank repair facility and former ammunition storage depot in Hadzisi, and Hanpajsk artillery storage and barracks. Clear and unambiguous findings of penetrators or contamination points on the ground and soil was found at each of these sites, as well as water contamination at one site, air contamination at 2 sites, and in botanical samples taken at 3 sites. No dew was found at any of the other sites, which may be due to some or all of the following reasons. There is no presence of dew in the area, the most likely scenario. Dew contamination has been covered by soil, grass and other growth in the time that has passed since the military conflict and is therefore no longer detectable by direct field measurements. However, subsequent laboratory analyses of soil and botanical samples would have revealed such hidden activity. Dew penetrators have penetrated so deeply into the ground that they are undetectable by both direct field measurements and laboratory analyses. 100% of the area was not searched due to the risk of mines. Where only a minor part of the total area was inaccessible, conclusions could be made by extrapolation. However, no clear conclusions could be drawn where a major part of the area was inaccessible. Samples were somehow taken only in uncontaminated parts of an area. However, by taking samples from several locations within a site, the risk of missing something is significantly reduced. The area was searched prior to the mission and dew penetrators removed and contamination cleaned up. As sophisticated equipment was used both in the field and laboratory, it was concluded that there was no dew contamination at investigated sites when nothing was detected. The overall findings for the 14 sites investigated are summarized below. No findings for the Rosca site, 76mm at self-prop gun, are included as investigations were not possible due to the heavy presence of mines. The corresponding conclusions and recommendations are presented in chapters 5 and 6, respectively. The assessments of risk mentioned below are discussed in more detail in Appendix A. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 29. 4.2 Findings. A. Localized contamination of surface soil. If a large number of penetrators hit hard surfaces and partly aerosolize on impact, there is a risk of inhaling airborne dew dust if people are nearby during an attack. As the aerosols disperse and fall out, resulting contamination of the ground surface may be localized or widespread, depending on the properties of the aerosols and the prevailing meteorological conditions. No dew was present in the soil samples collected from Foča, Srbija. The same conditions occur during destruction by blasting of ammunition containing dew, although under controlled conditions the risk of inhalation and contamination of the surrounding area can be minimized. Importantly, no indications of dew were measured at such sites, Kalinovac and Bielasnoka Plateau ammunition destruction sites, neither in water or soils samples, nor during radiometric surveys. Using portable beta and gamma radiation detectors, UNEP could not find any detectable and significant widespread contamination of the ground surface, soil, or beta environment except at localized points of concentrated contamination, referred to as contamination points, c.b. below. These were close to penetrators lying on the ground, penetrator impact sites or penetrator holes. The level of dew detected decreased rapidly with distance from contamination points and was no longer detectable by field measurements beyond a distance of 1 meter. However, through laboratory analyses of soil samples, ground contamination could in some cases be detected around contamination points at distances less than 200 meters from the nearest identified contamination point, defined in this report as localized ground contamination. Of the 14 sites investigated, only 3 had dew in soil that was detectable using sampling and laboratory analyses. Importantly, as not all soil samples at these 3 sites showed contamination, this indicates more localized, as opposed to widespread, contamination of the sites. Undetectable dew contamination of the soil means that possible dew contamination was so small that it could not be differentiated from natural uranium present in the soil. All the soil samples were taken by and analyzed at SP's laboratory in Switzerland. Assessment of risk. Contamination of the ground surface and upper layer, 0 to 5 centimeters, of the ground was very low. Therefore, the corresponding radiological and chemical risks are insignificant. B. contamination points. Localized points of ground contamination occurred at the site of penetrator impact or close to a penetrator that had remained on the surface and been subject to corrosion. Dew concentration can be very high at these points, but the contamination was quite localized, normally within a radius of 0.1 meters, with widely variable concentrations, 0.01 to 100 grams dew, kg of soil. 30 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Overall findings. One of many corroded penetrator fragments collected from the Hadzisi tank repair facility. Remarkably, close to 300 contamination points were found during the mission, most of these at the tank repair site in Hadzisi. These findings are intriguing from 3 points of view. A great deal of precipitation has fallen over the intervening 8-year period, and yet this has dissolved and removed perhaps only a minor part of the dew. 2. Contamination has not been dispersed by wind. 3. Although certain contaminated areas have been used by various vehicles, the apparent mechanical agitation has not helped the contamination to disappear. These observations of slow dispersion in soil and resistance to mechanical agitation lead to the conclusion that ground and soil contamination may be permanent in nature. It is possible that more contamination points exist away from the searched areas. Due to the risk of mines and unexploded ordnance, surveys of some sites were quite limited. Assessment of risk. One risk is related to the possibility of some contaminated soil becoming airborne, through wind action or movement by people or animals, and being inhaled. Another risk is related to the possibility that dew from the contamination points eventually contaminates groundwater through drainage. However, in both these cases, the amount of dew at the contamination points was too low to cause any radiological and chemical problems either now or in the future. The corresponding risks are insignificant. The only risk of any significance would be from the possibility that someone came into direct physical contact with the contamination points and thereby contaminated their hands or directly ingested contaminated sand, soil. However, even if several grams of soil are ingested, the resulting exposure is insignificant with regard to the radiation from ingested uranium, less than 10 microsieverts. On the other hand, such exposure might be significant from the standpoint of heavy metal toxicity. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 31. 4. C. Dispersion in ground. There are scientifically valid reasons to believe that the chemical and physical properties of dew make it more liable to dispersion in soil than is the case for natural uranium. The issue of dew dispersion into the ground is of particular relevance in judging the risk of future groundwater contamination and, ultimately, drinking water supplies. See Appendix C for further details. The depth of contaminated soil caused by dispersion of dew below contamination points or penetrator was carefully studied. The major part of soil contamination was found in the upper 0 to 10 centimeters. And the concentration then fell by 1-2 orders of magnitude for each 10 centimeters further below. These results were similar to the ones from the UNEP mission to Kosovo in 2000. However, the depth of detectable dispersion had increased from 10 to 40 centimeters during the soil profiles collected from Han pipes revealed limited dispersion of dew into the ground. 5 additional years of dispersion as compared to the Kosovo findings. Importantly, the major part of measured activity, 98%, remained in the upper 10 centimeters. This vertical distribution results from dissolution and dispersion of dew from the initial superficial contamination, or from the penetrator lying on the surface. When comparing results with Kosovo, it should be noted that soil conditions at the investigated sites might be different from these in Kosovo. D. Penetrators as outlined in Chapter 2.3, and discussed in more detail in Appendix H. Analysis of dew penetrators, fragments and jackets. The fate of a dew penetrator after firing is governed by a wide range of variable factors, for example type of target, resistance of surface substrate, etc. Consequently, there are several possible explanations of why penetrators were found at some sites but not at others. Altogether, at the 3 sites where DU was discovered, some 10 penetrators, 2 jackets and several dozen fragments were found. The presence of a further 100 penetrators hidden in the ground were indicated by measurements. In most cases, the penetrators were located either on the ground surface, or superficially covered by leaves and grass. Those that were covered by less than 10 centimeters of soil were heavily corroded and, given a similar continued rate of an intact penetrator still in its jacket. 32. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Overall findings. Corrosion would disappear as solid objects from the environment within 25-35 years after impact into the ground. The penetrators that were lying on the ground surface were only mildly corroded. What occurs in the case of penetrators hidden deep in the ground has not yet been studied by UNEP and is an important unanswered scientific question. Most penetrators that were found on the surface or just below were picked up, but some of them were left in situ, as mentioned in Chapter 7 Site-Specific Findings. These sites therefore have to be searched and possible penetrators and contaminated soil dealt with. A penetrator cleaned from soil and DU corrosion products shows structural damage. As described above, the soil underneath and around penetrators on the ground surface was contaminated by DU. This finding is closely related to the corrosion of penetrators, which also illustrates one possible pathway for internal exposure. If a person not wearing protective gloves touches a corroded penetrator, hands may become contaminated, leading to a risk of DU ingestion. Due to the lack of widespread contamination, there are good reasons to believe that most of the DU rounds that were fired at the sites investigated did not fragment, but instead entered the ground more or less intact. In this way, they are a source of uranium that might influence the uranium concentration in drinking water in the future. Exceptionally, the amount of additional uranium in the affected areas might be 10-100 times naturally occurring levels. However, the additional amount would normally only represent a doubling of natural uranium levels. Penetrators were also analyzed with regard to their plutonium content, Pu-239-240, Uranium-236, U-236, and Neptunium, Np-237, see Appendix H. The isotopic composition and radiochemical analysis confirmed the overall picture for penetrators and fragments that emerged from the UNEP DU missions to Kosovo, and Serbia and Montenegro. The depletion level in all samples measured was constant, that is 0.200 plus minus 0.001% U-235 by weight. In addition, the level of U-236 in penetrators was confirmed to be 0.0028% by weight. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 33. 4. The radiochemical analyses also confirmed the very low presence of plutonium and neptunium in the penetrators. For plutonium, activity concentrations were 0.0050 to 0.0878 becquerels/G penetrator, which corresponds to 2.2 E-12 to 38.2 E12 grams Pu, G penetrator. For neptunium, the concentration was very low at less than 0.004 to 0.0162 becquerels/G. The presence of these radioactive elements in the DU indicates that at least some of the depleted uranium came from reprocessed material from spent nuclear fuel or from contamination of equipment during the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel. The amount of plutonium, neptunium and U-236 found did not have any significant impact on the overall radioactivity of penetrators or corresponding health risk. Assessment of risk. People may pick up penetrators lying on the ground. Several grams of corroded uranium could easily be removed from the penetrators through mechanical contact. This would constitute a potential risk of being internally contaminated through ingestion. Even if only a small part of the available DU were to pass into the body, the resulting radiation dose, although relatively high, would still be less than 1 millisievert. In terms of health standards relating to chemical toxicity, the possible intake is not small with respect to annual tolerable intakes. Another risk of exposure from a heavily corroded penetrator is by inhalation. Care has to be taken in handling a penetrator to avoid corroded becoming airborne. With conservative assumptions, inhalation might lead to significant doses, more than 1 mSv. A third risk of exposure is by external beta radiation to the skin where a penetrator is placed close to the body, such as in a pocket. Continuous exposure of the skin for several weeks can lead to local radiation doses, in excess of radiation safety guidelines, even though skin burns from radiation may not occur. The resulting gamma radiation exposure will be insignificant and, at most, of the same order of magnitude as natural radiation. Penetrators on the surface, and particularly those in the ground, may dissolve in time and slowly contaminate groundwater and drinking water. See Appendix C. As discussed in point G, below, drinking water has natural uranium content. Normal natural uranium concentration and annual intake by water in the areas visited is low, October 5, 2010 to 3 mg U.L. water and 0.01 to 1 mg uranium, year respectively, leading to radiation doses of less than 1 microSv/year. The increase of uranium from hidden penetrators at the sites could, vary locally, be 100 times the natural uranium content in the first meter below the surface. If that resulted in a corresponding increase of uranium concentration in water, the radiation dose would still be less than 1 mSv per year, but the uranium concentration could exceed WHO health standards for drinking water. However, many uncertainties exist and therefore some future analysis of uranium in drinking water close to the affected sites will be needed. Penetrators currently hidden in the ground may be dug up during future construction work. Should this occur, there would be corresponding risks of external exposure from beta radiation and the risk of internal exposure by contamination of hands and by inhalation, as described above. There are no risks of any significantly increased uptake of DUN plants either now or in the future as a consequence of penetrators remaining in the environment. Compare with point B, above. The measured concentration of plutonium in DU is 87.8 becquerels/kg DU at the most. This has to be compared with the activity of U-238 in DU, which is 12,400 becquerels/kg DU. That is about 150,000 times higher. The radiation dose per BQ of Pru is much higher than per BQ of DU, particularly with regard to doses caused by inhalation. By combining the relative activity and the dose factor, it is concluded that the Pru contained in the studied penetrators is about 1,000 times less hazardous than the DU itself. 34. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Overall findings. Analysis of uranium-236 in the penetrators showed a concentration of 0.0028% of the total uranium. The content of U-236 in the penetrators is so small that the radiotoxicity is unchanged when compared to DU without U-236. Jackets, casings. A jacket is the part of the projectile that holds the penetrator. It stops upon impact against a hard surface, while the penetrator enters the target. Only 2 jackets were found, this small number being another indication that most of the penetrators missed hard targets and penetrated the ground with the jacket attached. Assessment of risk. The potential risks from jackets are much lower than those from penetrators because they are made of aluminium and are only slightly contaminated with DU. Military vehicles hit by DU. Although many vehicles were probably hit by DU during the conflict, none could be investigated by UNEP. It was reported that the vehicles had been removed from the sites, but no information could be provided on where they may now be stored, or how they were disposed of. Assessment of risk. If any DU-hit vehicles are identified, even if the risk of contamination may be small, some precautions should be. Tanks and APCs are the usual targets when using depleted uranium munitions. Taken to avoid any unnecessary risk. Before entering a vehicle, some decontamination of the interior of the vehicle might be needed. Before being considered safe, A qualified expert, taking due regard for appropriate safety regulations, should carry out the decontamination work. G. Contamination of water. 19 water samples from 11 investigated sites were taken for laboratory analysis. All the water measurements are summarized in Appendix C. The uranium concentration was found to vary from 0.02 to 2.7 micrograms/L water, that is within the normal range of uranium concentration in drinking water. Tap water from a local source near the Bielasnoka Plateau. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 35. 4. Unlike the two previous assessments, decontamination of groundwater was found at one of the sites, Hadzici Tank Repair Facility. The concentration was low and insignificant from a radiological and chemical toxicological point of view, but was indicative of possible future water contamination over time. This finding justifies the need for continued checking of possible decontamination of drinking water in the future. Assessment of risk. On the basis of these findings, there are no significant risks from DU in water at present. H. Contamination of air samples were taken at 6 sites. With the exception of the Foka, Srbinj, Bridge site, sampling was done at 2 or more locations within the fenced areas, and was chosen based on wind direction or either inside or in proximity to any contaminated buildings. The concentration of uranium in air varied from 0.011 10 to 6 mg/m3, 0.14 microbecquerels/m3, to 3.6 10 to 6 mg/m3, 43 microbecquerels/m3, see Appendix G, Table G.6. All but 2 of the samples showed concentrations within the normal range of uranium in air. All results from air samples are summarized in Appendix G. 2 sites showed clear indications of DU in the air. Of the 2 samples with higher than normal uranium concentration, one was collected at the former Hadzici Tank Repair Facility and the other at the Hanpajsk Artillery Storage and Barracks. These samples contained over 90% DU, which was caused by wind or suspension of DU dust on the ground. Modern air samplers will run for several where significant dust and particles are present in hours at most sites. The air from nearby ground surfaces, and DU dust, is present on these local surfaces. It is likely that DU will be found in air under certain wind conditions or human activities that raise the dust into the air. In these circumstances, air samplers provide a good measure of potential inhalation risk and DU should be detectable. DU in air can also depend on resuspension caused by human activities such as moving around, digging, driving vehicles, etc. Only one air sample was taken during ongoing human activities at both sites, which could have impacted the results. Assessment of risk. The natural concentration of uranium in air normally causes very low doses from the uranium isotopes alone, in the order of 0.1 to 1 microSievert/year. This was also the case at all sites measured, including the 2 sites with measurable DU concentration in air. I. Contamination of botanical material. Samples of botanical material such as moss, bark and lichen were taken at 11 sites in order to search for possible DU uptake and to identify any previous or ongoing airborne contamination. As illustrated in UNEP's previous DU assessments, moss, bark and lichen are sensitive indicators of past airborne contamination for DU dust or particles generated at the time of attack or by later resuspension. 36. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Overall findings. The presence of DU in lichen, bark and moss samples indicates the earlier presence of DU in air in 3 of the 11 sites, the former Hadzici Tank Repair Facility and Ammunition Storage Depot, and Hanpajsk Artillery Storage and Barracks. This indicates that at least some of the penetrators at these sites hit hard targets and surfaces, partly aerosolized into dust, and dispersed into the air. J. Box of loose DU ordnance. One of UNEP's tasks was to investigate the history and location of the box containing DU penetrators, fragments and jackets, casings originally located at the former Hadzici Tank Repair Facility, see Chapter 7.1. Despite numerous inquiries, additional information concerning the location of the box was unavailable both from SVAR and local workers and authorities. Based on information later provided by NATO, it was confirmed that the box containing DU collected material was transferred in spring 2001 to U.S. national facilities outside Bosnia and Herzegovina for disposal. Lichen samples from trees and other surfaces helped reveal the earlier presence of DU at certain sites. Jackets and penetrators recovered by SVAR at Hatsisi, source, NATO. K, International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the low-level radioactive waste repository of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, FB, provides an adequate facility for the safe storage of radioactive waste, including depleted uranium residues. Work on the construction of a treatment and conditioning facility for the radioactive waste has started. The treatment facility will improve the capability of the Center for Radiation Protection to deal with radioactive waste. Unfortunately, no repository for low-level radioactive waste is operational in Republika Srpska, although progress has been made towards identifying a possible location where the repository could be built. There were a significant number of radioactive sources, such as industrial sources, lightning rods and smoke detectors, in use on the territory of B before the war. Many of these sources have become obsolete or were lost or damaged during the war and have yet to be recovered. The risks from potential exposure to them are significantly higher than those from exposure to DU residues. Consideration should be given to the storage and eventual disposal of these sources and in particular to those lost or damaged during the war. L. World Health Organization, WHO, information on cancers, cancer rates and trends is incomplete in both the FI and the Republika Srpska. Claims of increases in many types of cancers were made by physicians based on clinical observations but were not substantiated by information on cancer rates, which relate the number of cases to the population these cases come from. Therefore, no. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 37. 4. A crater created by ammunition blasting at the Bielasnoka Plateau. Conclusions can be made on whether there is any change in cancer frequency. However, this situation is improving. In particular, the cancer registries aimed at establishing complete ascertainment of cancers and to avoid double counting have been set up in parts of the FI and in the Republika Srpska. M. Heavy metal contamination during the mission. Heavy metal contamination of topsoil was found at both a former ammunition production site, Vogoska, and 2 ammunition destruction sites. Contamination through such activities at those types of sites is a known occurrence elsewhere in the world. However, for certain heavy metals, such as lead, copper, nickel, etc., the intervention levels for soil contamination were already reached. This is reason for some concern. 38. 38 Post-conflict environmental assessment. General findings. 4.1 Overview. During the mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the following locations were investigated: the former tank repair facility in Hadiki, Lukovica, the barracks in Hadiki, the former ammunition storage in Hadiki, the hill near Pjeljukovic, site of the T-55 tank, the barracks in Han Pajesk, a warehouse in Han Pajesk, the Karan barracks in Pale, the former ammunition production facility in Vogoska, the location of the barracks in Ustakolina, the bridge in the town of Fo. A. The location of the water tank in Kalinovic, the location for the destruction of ammunition in Kalinovic, the location for the destruction of ammunition on the plateau in Bielasnoka. These locations were selected for investigation based on information received that depleted uranium is likely to be used there or that there may be a risk of contamination with depleted uranium due to other activities. Depleted uranium was found at the 3 locations mentioned above, at the location of the former tank repair facility and former ammunition warehouse in Hadikim, the barracks and the artillery weapons warehouse in Han Pajesk. At those locations, clear and unambiguous findings of radioactive grains or those were found. AKA contamination on the ground and in the ground. At one of these locations, water contamination was found, at 2 locations, air contamination, and at 3 locations, Contamination in floor samples. Depleted uranium was not found at other locations, which may be due to some or all of the reasons listed below. There is no presence of depleted uranium in that area, most likely scenario. Soil contaminated with depleted uranium has been covered by soil, grass and other vegetation since the time of the military conflict and therefore can no longer be detected by direct measurement in the field. However, such hidden activity would in this case was detected in soil and plant samples that were later subjected to laboratory analysis. Radioactive grains with depleted uranium have penetrated so deeply into the ground that they are impossible to detect either by direct field measurements or laboratory analyses. Due to the danger of mines, 100% of each location was not searched. If only a small part of the total space is not available, conclude, and can be derived by extrapolation. If the reverse is true, alas, no clear conclusions can be drawn. 6. Samples were taken only in uncontaminated parts of a location. However, by taking samples from several places in one location, it obviously reduces the risk that something is missed. The site was inspected prior to the mission and depleted uranium grains and contamination were removed. However, given that sophisticated equipment was used both in the field and in the laboratories, he concluded. It is said that there is no such contamination at the investigated locations where contamination with depleted uranium was not detected. The following is a brief overview of the general findings from 14 researched locations. There are no findings for the 15th location, self-propelled gun 76 mm at, because it was not possible to investigate that location due to the presence of a large number of mines. Answering the conclusion and recommendations are presented in chapters 5 and 6. The risk assessments listed below are explained in more detail in Annex A. 4. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 39. 4. 4.2 Findings. A. Localized contamination of the surface soil layer. If a large number of radioactive grains hit hard surfaces and split, but disperse particles in the form of aerosols at the time of impact, there is a danger that people who are near the impact site during the attack will inhale depleted uranium dust carried by the air. As aerosols disperse and fall, the resulting surface soil contamination may be localized or widespread, depending on the properties of the aerosol and the prevailing meteorological conditions. The same conditions exist during the activity of destroying ammunition containing depleted uranium, although the danger of inhalation and contamination of the environment can be minimized under controlled conditions. It is important that at such locations where ammunition was destroyed in Kalinovic and on the plateau in Bielaznovka, no indicators of depleted uranium were found, neither in the analyzed water or soil samples, nor during radiometric measurements. By using portable beta and gamma air detectors, INJA, the UNEP team did not detect any any widespread contamination of the surface of the soil, earth or flora, except in localized places of concentrated contamination called that contamination, CNE, under B. Theta. Or near the radioactive grains that were on the ground, near the point of impact of the grains or the holes made by the grains. The level of depleted uranium detected decreased rapidly with distance from aka contamination, and could no longer be detected by field measurement at a distance greater than 1 meter. However, laboratory analyses and soil samples are in some cases. UJVA discovered traces of soil contamination at a distance of less than 200 meters from the nearest identified site. Contamination. In this report it is defined as localized soil contamination. Of the 14 investigated locations, the presence of depleted uranium in the soil was detected in only 3 through sampling and laboratory analyses. An important indication that the contamination at those 3 locations is localized and not widespread comes from the fact that not all soil samples at those 3 locations showed contamination. The absence of detection of soil contamination with depleted uranium and that the possible contamination with depleted uranium is so small that the difference between depleted and natural uranium present in the soil could not be determined. All soil samples were taken and analyzed by SPE's laboratories in Switzerland. Risk assessment. Contamination of the soil surface and the top layer, 0 to 5 cm, of the soil is very low. Therefore, the corresponding radiological and chemical risk is infinite. Agent. B. That. Contamination localized to. Contamination of the soil surface appears at the point of impact of a radioactive grain or near a grain that remained on the surface and was exposed to corrosion. The concentration of depleted uranium can be very high at that time. But the contamination is prickly. But localized, but in a radius of 0.1 meters, and the concentration varies greatly, from 0.01 to 100 grams of depleted uranium per kilogram of land. 40. Post-conflict environmental assessment. General findings. Interestingly, almost 300 Ta were found during the mission. AKA contamination, mostly at the location of the tank repair facility in Hadiki. These findings are interesting from 3 points of view. A lot of precipitation fell during the 8-year period, but it seems to have dissolved and took away only a small part of the depleted uranium. 2. Contamination is not dispersed by wind. 3. Although they are different IDA vehicles passed over certain contaminated parts, apparently mechanical, whose action did not contribute to the disappearance of the contamination. This observation of slow penetration in the ground and mechanical resistance, which action they lead to the conclusion. Even if the contamination of the surface of the soil and earth may be permanent by its nature, it is possible that there are more, aka contamination outside the investigated locations. Due to the danger of mines and unexploded ammunition, the exploration of some locations was necessary, but limited. There. Risk assessment. One of the risks is related to the possibility of the contaminated soil being carried by the wind, the movement of people or animals, or being inhaled in the form of dust. Another danger is related to the possibility of depleted uranium on Ta. Sooner or later, the pool of contamination swells and contaminates the groundwater. However, in both of these cases, of depleted uranium on Ta, the level of contamination is too small to cause any radiological or chemical problems now or in the future. The corresponding risks are endless. The only danger of knowing would arise from the possibility of someone coming to the immediate physical key contact with Ta contamination and thus contaminates hands or directly ingests contaminated sand, soil. However, even if a few grams of soil are ingested, the resulting exposure is negligible in terms of exposure damage by ingested uranium, less than 10 microsieverts. On the other hand, such exposure may be known from the point of view of talks of heavy metals. 41 Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 4. C. Dispersion in the country. There are no but valid reasons to believe that it is due to its chemical and physical properties. Depleted uranium is more prone to dispersion in the soil than natural uranium. The question of the dispersion of depleted uranium in the soil is of particular importance when assessing the risk of future groundwater contamination and, finally, a supply of water for pike. See Annex C for details. Read it carefully. Then a depth of soil contamination caused by the dispersion of depleted uranium below Ta, aka contamination or radioactive grains. Most of the soil contamination was found in the upper 0 to 10 centimeters, and the concentration then decreased by 1-2 orders of magnitude in every 10 centimeters. These results are as follows. Nor those who were reached by the UNEP mission that went through it. The presence of depleted uranium in Kosovo in 2000, however, the depth of dispersion, which can be registered, increased from 10 centimeters to 40 centimeters during 5 additional years of this dispersion in comparison with findings from Kosovo. It is important that a large part of the measured activity, 98%, remained in the upper 10 centimeters. This vertical distribution is the result of dissolution and dispersion of depleted uranium from Po. Ethnic surface contamination, or from radioactive grains lying on the surface. When comparing the results with those from Kosovo, it should be noted that it is possible that the soil conditions at the investigated locations differ from those in Kosovo. D. Radioactive grains as explained in Chapter 2.3 and discussed in more detail in Annex H. Analysis of depleted uranium radioactive grains, fragments and grain jacket. The fate of depleted uranium grains after firing depends on a large number of variable factors, for example, type of target, resistance of the material it hits, etc. Therefore, there are several possible explanations for why radioactive grains were found in some locations and not in others. In total, about 10 radioactive grains, 2 casings, and several dozen fragments were found at 3 locations where depleted uranium was detected. Measurements shows that another 100 grains were present hidden in the ground. In old age, the grains were either on the surface of the soil or slightly covered by leaves and grass. Radioactive grains that were covered by less than 10 centimeters of soil were highly corroded and, provided they resembled. If the rate of corrosion continues, it may disappear from the environment as type of objects for some 25-35 years from penetration into the country. The radioactive grains lying on the surface of the earth were only slightly corroded. UNEP has not yet proved. Wow, what's happening in the ear? There are radioactive grains hidden deep in the earth, and this is important for science. But an unanswered question. Most of the radioactive grains that were found on the surface of the soil or just below the surface layer of the soil were removed, but some remained in their original position, such as it is in Chapter 7 Land on Individual. Those locations. That is why these locations should be investigated and the problem of possible radioactive grains and contaminated land should be solved. As described above, the soil beneath and around the radioactive grains was contaminated with depleted uranium at the surface layer. This finding is closely related to the corrosion of radioactive grains, which also illustrates one of the possible type of internal exposure. If a person, who is not wearing protective gloves, touches a corroded radioactive grain, he may contaminate his hands, which leads to the risk of swallowing depleted uranium. Given that the contamination is not widespread, there are good reasons to believe that a large part of the depleted uranium grains that were fired at the investigated locations did not fragment, but sank into the ground more or less intact. They represent a source of uranium that may in the future affect the concentration of uranium in drinking water. Exceptionally, the amount of additional uranium in the affected locations can be 100 times higher than the natural background. However, those extra but it only represents a double, increasing the activity level of natural uranium. 42 Post-conflict environmental assessment. General findings. Radioactive grains were also analyzed in relation to the composition of plutonium, Pu-239-240, uranium-236, U-236, and neptunium, Np-237, see Annex H. Analysis of isotope composition and radiochemical analysis confirm the general picture of radioactive grains and fragments that was obtained during the missions of the UNEP assessment of depleted uranium in Kosovo and Serbia and Montenegro. The level of depletion in all measured samples was constant, E0.200 plus minus 0.001% U-235 by weight. Also, it was confirmed that the level of U-236 in the radioactive grains is 0.0028% by weight. Radiochemical analyses also confirmed the very low presence of plutonium and neptunium in the radioactive grains. For plutonium, activity concentrations ranged from 0.0050 to 0.0878 becquerels/g per radioactive grain, corresponding to 2.2 E-12 to 38.2 E12 grams Pu, G. Radioactive grain. Concentration in the ear. The O of neptunium was very low, less than 0.0042 to 0.0162 becquerels per gram. The presence of these radioactive elements in depleted uranium indicates that at least some of the depleted uranium came from the processing of spent nuclear fuel material or contamination of equipment during the processing of spent nuclear fuel. Car. The type of plutonium, neptunium, and U-236 found had no clue. Significant impact on the overall radioactivity of the radioactive grains, nor did it pose a corresponding health hazard. Risk assessment. It happens that people lift radioactive grains from the surface of the ground. Mechanical. It is easy to remove a few grams of corroded uranium from a radioactive grain by contact. This could pose a potential risk of internal contamination by ingestion. If you would. Even if a small part of the available depleted uranium entered the body, the resulting radiation dose, although relatively high, would still be below 1 mSv. In terms of health standards related to chemical toxicity, NES, the potential intake is not small compared to the annual intake that is tolerated. Inhaling depleted uranium aerosols also poses a risk of exposure to highly corroded radioactive grains. People must handle such a radioactive grain carefully to avoid airborne transmission of corroded depleted uranium. Pessimists. It is assumed that such inhalation can be reflected in knowledge. With significant doses of oxygen. Exposure, more than 1 mSv. The greatest risk of exposure is the external environment. Exposure to beta radiation, which can happen if a person puts a radioactive grain close to the body, for example, in a dep. Continuous exposure over several weeks can lead to local doses of air, which exceed the doses specified in the recommendations related to radiological safety, although the radiation does not have to cause burns to the body. The resulting exposure to gamma rays. Injubaik Bezna. Ajna I, in the worst case. He says in the same order. Ein as well as natural air. Inj. Radioactive grains on the soil surface, and especially those in the ground, can dissolve over time and slowly contaminate groundwater and well water, see Annex E. As noted in INTA. Key, G, drinking water also contains natural uranium. The normal concentration of natural uranium and the annual intake of water in cut sites are low, 10.5 to 10 to 3 mg of uranium per liter of water or 0.01 to 1 mg of uranium per year, which is reflected in air doses. Events that do not exceed 1 microsievert per year. The increase in uranium from hidden radioactive grains at the locations could be, very locally, 10 to 100 times greater than the content of natural uranium at the first meter of depth below the ground surface. If this would result in a corresponding increase in the concentration of uranium in the water, the radiation dose would still be less than 1 mSv per year, but the concentration of uranium would be a century above the health standards set by the World Health Organization. 43 Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 4. Regulations for water for pike. However, there are still many uncertainties, and that is why in the future it is necessary to carry out analysis of uranium in the water for pikas near the affected locations. It is possible that during construction works in the future, radioactive grains that are currently hidden in the ground will be dug up. If this were to happen, there would be corresponding risks from external exposure to beta air, and the risk of internal exposure through hand contamination and inhalation, as described above. There is no danger that the absorption of depleted uranium by plants will be known now or in the future. Significantly increased due to the fact that radioactive grains are still found in the environment, compare with the above table. B. The measured concentration of plutonium in depleted uranium did not exceed 87.8 becquerels per kilogram of depleted uranium. This must be compared with the activity of U-238 in depleted uranium, which is 12,400,000 becquerels per kilogram of depleted uranium, that is, it is higher than plutonium about 150,000 times. Radiation dose of plutonium per unit of air. In Becquerel is much higher than the air dose of depleted uranium according to Becquerel, especially when it comes to doses caused by inhalation. By combining relative activity and dose factors, the contaminated plutonium is said to have been found in pro with radioactive grains about 1,000 times less harmful than depleted uranium itself. Analysis of uranium-236 in radioactive grains showed a concentration of 0.0028% of total uranium. The content of U-236 in radioactive grains is so small that it is radiotoxic. Unchanged compared to depleted uranium without U-236. Liners / Orika is a part of a projectile that contains a radioactive grain. It stops when it hits a hard surface while the radioactive grain enters the target. Only 2 liners were found. The small number of casings found is an additional indicator that most of the radioactive grains did not hit hard targets and that they penetrated the ground together with the casing. Risk assessment. The potential risks from the liners are much greater than the risks from the radioactive grains because the liners are made of aluminum and are only slightly contaminated with depleted uranium. Military vehicles affected by depletion. Uranium. Although a large number of vehicles were probably hit by depleted uranium during the conflict, the UNEP team was unable to trace a single vehicle. It was said that the vehicles were removed from the locations, but no one could provide information about where those vehicles are now, or what happened to them. Risk assessment. If any vehicle affected by depleted uranium is identified, even if the risk of contamination is small, some precautions should be taken before entering the vehicle to avoid unnecessary risk. It may be necessary to carry out some decontamination of the interior of the vehicle before it can be considered safe. Decontamination should be performed by a qualified professional, which will take into account the appropriate safety rules. 44. Post-conflict environmental assessment. General findings. Water contamination. 19 water samples were taken from 11 investigated locations for laboratory analysis. All water measurements are summarized in Annex E. Uranium concentration varied from 0.02 to 2.7 micrograms per liter of water, within the normal range of uranium concentration in pond water. In contrast to the previous 2 missions, at one location, in the tank repair facility in Hadiki, groundwater contamination with depleted uranium was determined. Concentration was low and abysmal. Significant from a radiological and chemical toxicological point of view, but indicative with regard to water contamination that may occur over time. This finding justifies continued monitoring of possible contamination of water by depleted uranium in the future. Risk assessment. Based on current findings, there is currently no known danger from depleted uranium in water. Air contamination. Air samples were taken at 6 locations, with the exception of the bridge location info, and samples taken at 2 or more times, aka inside fenced locations, and so on, were selected based on wind direction, or inside or near contaminated buildings. The concentration of uranium in the air varied from 0.011 to 6 mg/m3, 0.14 microbecquerels per m3, to 3.6 to 6 mg/m3, 43 microbecquerels per m3, see Annex G, Table G.6. With the exception of 2 samples, all other samples showed concentrations within the normal range of uranium in air. All the results of the analysis of air samples are presented briefly in Annex G. 2 locations showed clear indications of the presence of depleted uranium in the air. One of the samples with a higher than normal concentration of uranium was taken from the former. 45 depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 4. Of the tank repair facility in Hadik, and the other was taken near the barracks in Han Pajesk. These samples contained more than 90% of depleted uranium, and the reason for this is that the wind raised dust with depleted uranium from the ground again. If it is in the air, it knows Inner dust high. Dust from the surrounding soil surfaces, ag locations, and depleted uranium dust is present on these local surfaces. It is likely that depleted uranium will be found in the air under the influence of certain winds or human activities that raise the dust into the air. In this sense, the instruments represent a good tool for measuring the potential risk of inhaling depleted uranium aerosols, and it would be possible to detect depleted uranium with them. The presence of depleted uranium in the air also depends on its re-elevation into the air caused by human activities, such as movement, digging, driving, etc. At both locations, only one air sample was taken during human activities that could have caused pollution. Into the results. Risk assessment. Natural concentration of uranium in the air OB. But causes very low doses. Only uranium isotopes are of the same order as Vali. Ein 0.1 to 1 micros yvert per year. This is SLU. And at all measured locations, INCO. Ujuki and 2 locations with measurable concentrations of depleted uranium in the air. Contamination of floor material. Samples of floor material, such as moss, tree bark and lichens, were taken from 11 sites to investigate the possibility of uptake of depleted uranium and to identify past or present airborne contamination. As illustrated in previous UNEP assessments of depleted uranium, mosses, tree bark and lichens are sensitive indicators of past contamination by dust or by the dust of depleted uranium through the air, which were created during the attack or by the later rising of that dust or it blows into the air. The presence of depleted uranium in samples of lichen, tree bark and moss indicated the formal presence of depleted uranium in the air at 3 of the 11 locations, the tank repair facility and ammunition depot in Hadik and the barracks in Han Pajesk. This indicates that at least some radioactive grains at those locations hit hard targets and surfaces, partly dispersed and turned into dust and exploded in the air. Box of collected depleted uranium ammunition. One of the tasks of UNEP was to investigate both the history and location of the box of depleted uranium grains, fragments, casings and ore that was originally located in the tank repair facility in Hadik, C 7.1. Regardless of numerous inquiries, neither SFAR, nor local workers, nor the authorities could provide additional information regarding the location of the box. Based on the information that was later provided by NATO, it was confirmed that the box with the collected material with depleted uranium in the spring of 2001. Prima. Woman to a U.S. national facility outside Bosnia and Herzegovina for disposal. J. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, Federation Low-Level Radioactive Waste Repository is an adequate facility for the safe storage of radioactive waste in the territory of the Federation, including contain the remains of depleted uranium. Work on the construction of a facility for the processing and storage of radioactive waste has begun. EO. That facility will enhance the Air Defense Center's capability. That he will leave and the radioactive waste. Unfortunately, in the Republika Srpska, no low-level radioactive waste disposal site is operating, although in other progress in finding a possible location where such a landfill would be built. 46. Post-conflict environmental assessment. General findings. Before the war, ZNO was used on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. A significant number of radioactive sources, such as industrial sources, lightning rods and occurs. And a half-acre. Many of these sources are outdated, lost or damaged during the war and have yet to be found. The risks of potential exposure to these sources are known. Significantly greater than the risk of exposure to depleted uranium residues. Priority should be given to the storage and subsequent disposal of these sources, and especially to the finding and safe storage or disposal of sources that were lost or damaged during the war. World Health Organization, WHO, information on cancer incidence rates and trends are incomplete in both the Federation and Republika Srpska. Claims about Century N. The prevalence of many types of cancer has been reported by doctors based on clinical findings. many observations, but their claims are not supported by information on cancer rates, which link the number of cases of the people and the population where they listen to you. Acts appear. So, no conclusions. C cannot be reported as to whether there is a change in U of cancer. However, the situation is improving. Specifically, in parts of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, records of cancer cases were introduced with the aim of determining all cases of cancer patients and avoiding double registration. L. Heavy metal contamination during the mission. Heavy metal contamination of the soil surface was found both at the location of the former ammunition production facility and at 2 locations where ammunition is destroyed. It is known that in other parts of the world there is pollution caused by the mentioned activities in such locations. However, the levels of soil pollution with some heavy metals, such as lead, copper, nickel, have been reached, which require intervention. This is somewhat worrying. 47 Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 5. Conclusions. 5.1 Introductory Notes. A. The conclusions and observations in this section refer to the 15 sites that were visited and investigated during the UNEP mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina, B. from 12 October 24, 2002. B. A significant radiological risk is defined in this report to be where the expected radiation dose would be more than 1 millisievert per year. A significant toxicological risk means that the expected concentration or intake would exceed WHO health standards, WHO 1998A, 1998B. Insignificant radiological risks are those where the corresponding dose is less than 1 millisievert. Insignificant toxicological risks correspond to intakes below WHO health standards, see Appendix A. C. Although corresponding radiological and toxicological risks in most cases are insignificant, UNEP calls for precautionary cleanup steps at certain sites as it is deemed unnecessary for any local populations to be exposed when simple, inexpensive measures can be taken to either remove or ameliorate the due contamination. D. In comparison with the 2 previous UNEP missions, many different conditions applied to the work conducted in B. Yet, the results from each mission remain broadly compatible. One essential difference was that 7 years had elapsed since the military conflict. This had led to further corrosion of dew penetrators lying in the ground, more growth covering impact points, and to increased possibilities of dew contamination in water. 5.2 Conclusions. Based on the findings discussed in Chapter 4, and on a site-specific basis in Chapter 7, the overall conclusions of the UNEP mission are as follows. 1. Investigated sites. A. The UNEP team visited 15 sites, of which one of the NATO-confirmed sites was inaccessible due to the presence of mines, 76 mm at self-prop gun. 3 of the 14 sites investigated clearly showed dew contamination, confirming the earlier use of dew ordnance, that is in Hadsisi, both the former tank repair facility and ammunition storage depot, and Hanpajsk artillery storage and barracks. These sites corresponded to confirmed NATO coordinates. Importantly, there are 6 NATO coordinates in the vicinity of Sarajevo which are still missing. These sites could therefore not be investigated. B. No dew contamination was found on the other 11 sites investigated. Based on the information collected in the field and subsequent laboratory work, it is highly unlikely that dew would have been used at these sites. Even if there had been a full cleanup of the sites following the attacks, analytical methods would have detected traces of dew in the soil, water and/or biota samples. 2. Localized ground contamination. None of the sites showed signs of widespread contamination of the ground surface, as nothing was detected by portable beta and gamma radiation detectors. At most, localized ground contamination was detected around contamination points at distances below 48. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Conclusions. 200 meters, but often much closer, as confirmed by the much more sensitive laboratory analyses of soil samples. This also indicates that most dew rounds probably never fragmented but penetrated into the ground. When penetrators enter ground that is more or less soft, significantly less dew dust results. The corresponding radiological and toxicological risks from such low-level contamination are insignificant. These observations are consistent with the findings from UNEP's 2 previous assessments. 3. Contamination points. A. Over 7 years had elapsed since the military conflict and UNEP's assessment mission. In 2000 to 2001, other international expert teams had searched many of the sites investigated by UNEP for penetrators and contamination points. Despite this, many penetrators and contamination points were still found and identified by UNEP. Ground surface dew contamination that is detectable by portable beta and gamma radiation detectors was typically limited to areas within 1 to 2 meters of penetrators and localized points of contamination caused by penetrator impacts. Almost 300 contamination points were identified during the mission, but most of them were only slightly contaminated. Each was marked for the authorities to address. B. Based on results of air filter measurements, contamination points may be formed by resuspension of dew particles in the air. However, no significant risk is expected to arise from these points through inhalation by local populations or possible contamination of water or plants. C. The only risk of any potential significance would be through touching a contamination point, thereby contaminating the body, with a risk of subsequent transfer to the mouth, or directly ingesting contaminated soil. However, with reasonable assumptions on intake of soil, the corresponding radiological risk would be insignificant, while from a toxicological point of view the possible intake might be somewhat higher than applicable health standards or guidelines. 4. Penetrators and fragments. A. During the mission 3 penetrators were collected for detailed analysis. There were also indications from field measurements of a large number hidden in the ground, contamination points. At the former Hatsisi tank repair facility, an unknown number of penetrators had been collected by both locals and SFAR troops. Given that several thousand dew rounds were reportedly fired against the target sites investigated, the number found is still low. It is concluded that there could be 4 possible explanations. The majority of the penetrators are buried deep in the ground. They are spread over larger, inaccessible areas within minefields. They have been removed during random site cleanup or during mine clearing activities. They have been removed in circumstances beyond the control of the authorities. For instance, by local people. The most probable and most widely applicable explanation is the first one, but the other 3 scenarios might also have occurred. B. Penetrator corrosion. Corrosion occurs relatively quickly when the penetrator remains in the ground and is surrounded by soil. A penetrator can be completely corroded to emitting corrosion products, for example uranium oxides and carbonates, in the 25-35 years following impact. These corrosion products may in turn dissolve and disperse in depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 49. 5. Water. However, the rate of corrosion depends on the composition of the soil. If the penetrator is lying on the ground surface, the corrosion rate is significantly lower. C. Penetrator contact. The corroded uranium is loosely attached and easily removable. Consequently, if such a penetrator is picked up, it could easily contaminate anyone handling it. Even if the probable resulting intake into the body is small, the radiological and toxicological risks should not be ignored. If a penetrator is placed near the body, such as in a pocket, there will be external beta radiation to the skin. After some weeks of continuous exposure, this could lead to localized radiation doses above safety standards. Even so, it is unlikely that there would be any adverse health effects from such exposure. D. Accidental penetrator recovery. Buried penetrators and jackets may be accidentally brought to the surface in the future through digging as part of soil removal or construction works. The corresponding risks would then be the same as for penetrators and jackets currently lying on the surface. E. Penetrator composition. The transuranic elements plutonium-239-240 and neptunium-237, as well as the uranium isotope U-236, were found to be present in the depleted uranium of those penetrators analyzed. However, the concentrations were very low, in the published range of the open military literature, and did not have any significant impact on their overall radioactivity or health risk. The composition is consistent with penetrators found in earlier assessments. 5. Soil contamination. The contamination of subsurface soil above and below penetrators was studied. The penetrators lay in undisturbed, grass-covered ground at a depth of 3 to 8 cm below the soil surface. Soil contamination around the penetrator was 45 grams of dew per kg of soil. Within 10 cm below the penetrator the dew concentration decreased by 2 orders of magnitude, and within the next 30 cm by a further 3 orders of magnitude. From these observations it is concluded that the mobility of corroded dew in the present soil composition is low due to the fact that it is retarded by sorption and coprecipitation with minerals. Groundwater contamination is unlikely due to the low mobility of dew corrosion products. 6. Water contamination. A. Dew could be clearly identified in one of the drinking water samples. A second drinking water sample from a well showed traces of dew contamination, which were detectable only through the use of mass spectrometric measurements. The concentrations are very low and the corresponding radiation doses are insignificant for any health risk. This is also the case with respect to toxicity of uranium as a heavy metal. However, because the mechanism that governs the contamination of water in a given environment is not known in detail, it is concluded that water sampling and measurements should continue for several years. B. As concluded above, it is probable that the majority of penetrators are hidden in the ground. They may constitute a risk of future groundwater and drinking water contamination where they lie close to water sources, as is the case for those samples indicating contamination, that is the wells were most likely lying in the line of attack. Although dew mobility is low, if a penetrator is located in the immediate vicinity of a water source, contamination may occur. Heavy firing of dew in an area could increase the potential source of uranium contamination of groundwater by a factor of 10 to 100, compared to the case of a single penetrator. While the radiation doses will be low, the resulting uranium concentration may exceed WHO health standards or guidelines for drinking water. 50. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Conclusions. 7. Bioindicator contamination. The presence of dew was found in lichen samples at the 3 sites mentioned above. This is an indication that some penetrators hit targets and hard surfaces, partly split into dust and dispersed into the air. This also illustrates that analysis of lichen samples is a useful method in monitoring the quality of the environment. 8. Vegetable samples. 2 vegetable samples, cabbage, were taken in the vicinity of the former Hadsisi tank repair facility. Results from these 2 samples are insufficient to allow for any scientific conclusion. There are no reasons to expect any dew in food due to the low dispersion rate in the ground and low uptake factor in food. 9. Air contamination. A. Dew contamination of air was found at 2 sites where dew use had been confirmed. This can be due to resuspension of dew particles by wind or human activities from contamination points, corroded penetrators or fragments lying on the surface. The concentrations were very low and resulting radiation doses were minor and insignificant. At distances over 100 meters from contaminated areas, no dew could be detected in the air. This may be due to limits on instrumentation detection. B. Dew contamination of air and some surfaces was found inside 2 buildings at the 2 sites mentioned above. This can be due to resuspension of dew particles by wind or human activities from contamination points, corroded penetrators or fragments laying on the surface inside, as well as any dew dust contained within the building since the time of attack. Although the low levels measured result in doses which are minor and insignificant, UNEP considers exposure to such a source unnecessary. Therefore, precautionary cleanup steps for areas of contamination are recommended. 10. Awareness raising. Throughout the mission, UNEP observed that workers and civilians with access to these sites, as well as military and mine clearing personnel, were unaware of or misunderstood the risks and issues with respect to ammunition in general. 11. Methodology. The techniques, equipment and methodologies used worked very well during the mission, and the experience from earlier missions contributed to the successful evaluations. 12. Radiation protection and radiation safety. A. The radiation safety infrastructure in B has only recently been established. In the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, FB, the new law on radiation protection and radiation safety establishing the basis for the new regulatory system was approved by Parliament in 1999. In the Republika Srpska, RS, legislation complying with the IAEA's international standards for protection against ionizing radiation was adopted in 2001. The efforts made in establishing an institutional radiation protection framework in B since the end of the conflict are commendable, considering the limited resources available and the encouraging results achieved, although more work is necessary to improve radiation protection. B. In addition to two independent legal frameworks for radiation protection, two separate regulatory authorities and radiation protection organizations have been created in the FB and RS. This results in a duplication of services and activities which is particularly inappropriate in view of the shortage of resources available. The lack of cooperation between the two radiation protection organizations negatively affects the establishment and implementation of an efficient radiation safety regime in Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 51. 5. C. The low-level radioactive waste repository of the FB provides an adequate facility for the safe storage of radioactive waste in the territory, including depleted uranium residues. Work on the construction of a treatment and conditioning facility for the radioactive waste has started, although no significant progress has been made in the last year. The treatment facility will improve the capability for the Center for Radiation Protection to deal with radioactive waste. Unfortunately, no repository for low-level radioactive waste is operational in Republika Srpska, although progress has been made towards identifying a possible location where the repository could be built. D. There were a significant number of radioactive sources, such as industrial sources, lightning rods and smoke detectors, in use throughout B before the war. Records for these are no longer available. Many of these sources have become obsolete or were lost or damaged during the war and have yet to be recovered. The risks from potential exposure to them are significantly higher than those from exposure to DU residues. Consideration should be given to the storage and eventual disposal of these sources, and in particular to those which were lost or damaged during the war. E. While normal environmental monitoring is not a high priority for B, where there are no significant sources of radioactive discharges from facilities, it is of concern that no activities are carried out to ensure the protection of members of the public in areas accessible to them and where radiation and/or risks from contamination may exist. This concerns particularly those areas where damaged or abandoned and uncontrolled sources may exist as a result of the disruption caused by the war. 13. Health concerns. Due to the lack of a proper cancer registry and reporting system, claims of an increase in the rates of adverse health effects stemming from DU cannot be substantiated. It is encouraging that the B authorities are in the process of implementing a registry and reporting system to detect and report cancers within the country. This should allow the verification of concerns about changes in the frequency of cancers. The scientific data on uranium and DU health effects developed over the last half-century, and the extremely low exposure identified in this UNEP mission, indicates that it is highly unlikely that DU could be associated with any of these reported health effects. 14. DU box. One of UNEP's tasks was to investigate the history and location of the box containing DU penetrators, fragments and jackets, casings originally located at the former Hatsisi tank repair facility, see Chapter 7.1. Based on a NATO fax dated December 3, 2002, the box containing DU material was transferred in spring 2001 to U.S. national facilities outside Bosnia and Herzegovina for disposal. 15. Heavy metals. At 3 of the sites investigated, high surface contamination of heavy metals was measured. Vogoska's ammunition production facility, and ammunition destruction sites at Kalinovic and the Bielasnoka Plateau. Such contamination could represent a potential future health risk. As the intervention values for certain elements in soil have already been reached, further investigation is required to properly assess the situation. 52. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Conclusions. 5.1 Introductory notes. A. Conclusion. Findings and observations in this section refer to 15 sites that were logged and investigated during the UNEP mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, B. 1224. October 2002. B. He knows. Agent radiological risk is defined in this report in SL. AGFIMA 1 FR. Equivalent dose of air. Higher than 1 millisievert per year. He knows. Agent toxicological risk knows. And that FR. Equivalent concentration or intake exceeds WHO health standards, WHO, 1998A, 1998B. Blessed. Significant radiological risks are those where the corresponding dose is less than 1 millisievert. Blessed. Significant toxicological risks correspond to intakes lower than WHO health standards, CNXA. C, although they are in the majority case, does not pose any relevant radiological and toxicological risks. Indeed, UNEP calls for precautionary measures. Claims of certain locations because he considers it unnecessary for the local population to be exposed to such risks if simple and cheap measures can be taken to remove or remediate the contamination with depleted uranium. D. In comparison with the previous two UNEP missions, during this mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the work of the mission was affected by many differences. ITI conditions. However, the results of all the missions are basically in agreement with each other. The only essential difference is that 7 years have passed since the military conflict. The result of this is further corrosion of radioactive grains with depleted uranium lying in the soil, great possibility of contamination of water with depleted uranium, and more vegetation that has in the meantime covered that. Strikes. 5.2 Conclusions. Based on the findings presented in Chapter 4, and presented by location in Chapter 7, the following general conclusions. And UNEP missions. 1. Investigated locations. A. The UNEP team visited 15 locations, one of which NATO confirmed was targeting depleted uranium, was not accessible due to the presence of mines, 76 mm at self-propelled gun. At 3 of the 14 investigated locations, contamination with depleted uranium was clearly measured. The name confirmed the earlier use of depleted uranium ammunition, in the former tank repair facility and ammunition storage in Hajduk, as well as in the barracks in Han Pajesk. These locations coincided with confirmed NATO coordinates. Importantly, NATO coordinates for 6 locations near Sarajevo are still missing. That is why it was not possible to investigate those locations. B. No contamination with depleted uranium was found at the other 11 investigated locations. Based on information gathered in the field and subsequent laboratory work, there is a very low probability that depleted uranium was used at those sites. Even if those locations were completely torn up after the attack, traces of depleted uranium would be detectable analytes. Which methods in soil, water and/or flora samples. 2. Localized soil contamination. There were no signs of widespread contamination of the surface layer at any location. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 53. 5. Lansen's portable beta and gamma air detectors. They did not detect anything. The most that was detected was the pollution of the localized land around that, aka contamination at a distance of less than 200 meters, but often much closer, as confirmed by much more sensitive laboratory analyses of soil samples. This also indicates that probably most of the depleted uranium grains were never split. Alas, it crashed into the ground. When the radioactive grain penetrates the ground, which is more or less soft, significantly less depleted uranium dust appears. The corresponding radiological and toxicological risks from such low-level contamination are negligible. Ajni. These observations are consistent with the findings of the previous two UNEP missions. 3. That 1. Contamination. A. More than 7 years have passed since the military conflict and the visit of the UNEP mission. During 2000 and 2001. Other international STR. The teams also explored many locations that are in Austria or in the rest of the world. Forces UNEP in search of radioactive seeds and that. Contamination. However, it is possible that many more radioactive grains and that aka contamination is found and identified. Depleted uranium contamination of the soil surface that can be detected by portable beta and gamma ray detectors. Dude. But it is limited. To a radius of 1-2 meters from radioactive grains and localized aka contamination caused by the impact of radioactive grains. Almost 300 were identified during the mission. Aka contamination, but most were only slightly contaminated. All that. The houses were marked so that the authorities could rehabilitate them. B. Based on the results of measuring the air filter, contaminations could be one of the sources of resurgence. Emission of depleted uranium into the air. In connection with this contamination, no existence is known. Real danger that the local population will breathe such air or from possible contamination of water or plants. C. The only known risk would be if someone touched that contamination. If he would contaminate his body, and risk later transmission to the mouth, or directly swallow the contaminated soil. However, taking into account reasonable assumptions about soil intake, the corresponding radiological risk would be negligible. Agent. While from a toxicological point of view, the possible intake would be somewhat higher than the existing limits specified in health standards or recommendations. 4. Radioactive grains and fragments. 3 radioactive grains were collected during the mission for detailed analysis. Field measurements also indicated that a large number of radioactive grains are hidden in the ground. Contamination. At the site of the former tank repair facility in Hajduk, local residents and SFAR soldiers collected an unknown number of radioactive grains. Given that several thousand bullets with depleted uranium were allegedly fired at the investigated locations that were targets, the number of radioactive grains found is still small. Conclusion. They are said to exist. 4 possible explanations. Most of the radioactive grains are buried deep in the ground. Radioactive grains are scattered over a large, inaccessible territory, in Minsk fields. They were removed during random different locations or during activities. Mine removal. They are removed in circumstances beyond the control of the authorities, by local population. The most probable and suitable explanation is the first one, and it is also possible that the other 3 scenarios took place. 54. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Conclude. B. Corrosion of radioactive grains. Corrosion occurs relatively quickly when the radioactive grain remains in the ground, surrounded by earth. A radioactive grain can completely corrode into corrosion products, like uranium oxides and carbonates, within 25-35 years after impact. These corrosion products, in turn, can dissolve and explode in water. However, the rate of corrosion depends on the composition of the soil. If the radioactive grain rests on the surface of the soil, the rate of corrosion is much slower. C. Touching a radioactive grain, corroded uranium is not kind of bonded and easily detached. Therefore, a person who picks up such a radioactive grain could easily be contaminated. Even if the probable intake into the body that follows is small, the radiological and toxicological risks should not be ignored. If a radioactive seed is placed near the body, for example in DEP, external factors followed. Beta ray exposure. Several weeks of continuous exposure can lead to localized irritation. Avania with doses of air. Events that exceed safety standards. Even in that case, it is unlikely that such exposure would result in any adverse health consequences. D. Listen. Apparent finding of radioactive grains. Buried radioactive grains and their sheaths can be accidental. Clearly brought to the surface by digging with the aim of removing soil or during construction works. The corresponding risks would then be the same as in the case of the radioactive grain and casing currently lying on the surface of the soil. E. Composition of the radioactive grain. The presence of transuranium elements, plutonium-239-240 and neptunium-237, as well as the uranium isotope U-236 in depleted uranium, was found in the analyzed radioactive grains. However, the concentration of these elements was very low, within the limits stated in the military literature available to the public, and had no known significant impact on their general radioactivity or was hazardous to health. The composition is consistent with radioactive grains found during previous missions. 5. Soil contamination. Contamination of the subsurface soil above and below the radioactive grains was examined. Radioactive grains are buried in undisturbed soil covered with grass, at a depth of 3 to 8 centimeters below the soil surface. Contamination of the soil around the radioactive grain amounted to 45 grams of depleted uranium per kilogram of soil. At a depth of up to 10 centimeters below the radioactive grain, the concentration of depleted uranium decreased by 2 orders of magnitude, and at a depth of 30 centimeters, by an additional 3 orders of magnitude. Based on these observations, he concluded, it is said that the mobility of corroded depleted uranium in the current composition of the soil is low because the fact that it is slowed down by sorption and co-precipitation with minerals. Groundwater contamination is unlikely due to the low mobility of depleted uranium corrosion products. 6. Water contamination. A. Depleted uranium was clearly identified in one of the pike water samples. Another sample of pike water from the well showed traces of depleted uranium contamination, which could only be detected using mass spectrometric measurements. The concentrations are very low and the corresponding doses of radiation are negligible. They do not pose any health hazard. It is also a slough. And about the docks. A foot of uranium as a heavy metal. However, since the details of the mechanism by which the water is contaminated are not known, he concluded. It is said that water sampling and measurement should be continued over the next few years. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 55. 5. B. As concluded above. There, most of the radioactive grains are probably hidden in the ground. These radioactive grains could pose a risk of groundwater and pike water contamination in the future as some of these water sources are located close to the attack line. This is in the rear of samples indicating contamination. Although the mobility of depleted uranium is low, contamination can occur if the radioactive grain is located in the immediate vicinity of a water source. Firing a large number of depleted uranium grains in an area could increase the potential source of uranium contamination of groundwater by a factor of 10 to 100, compared to the contamination produced by a single radioactive grain. Although doses are below, the resulting uranium concentration may exceed WHO health standards or drinking water recommendations. 7. Contamination of bioindicators. The presence of depleted uranium was found in lichen samples at the 3 locations mentioned above. This is an indication that some radioactive grains hit targets and hard surfaces, partly turned into dust that spread in the air. This also illustrates that lichen sample analysis is a useful method of environmental quality monitoring. 8. Topping samples. 2 samples of cabbage were taken near the former tank repair facility in Hajduk. The results of the analysis of these 2 samples are not sufficient to perform any science. Nog concluded. There is no reason for Fr. The occurrence of depleted uranium in food due to the low rate of spread in the soil and the low absorption factor in food. 9. Air pollution. A. Air contamination with depleted uranium was found at 2 locations where the use of depleted uranium was confirmed. The reason for this may be relifting into the air. Depletion of depleted uranium by wind or human activities from that, aka contamination, corroded radioactive grains or fragments lying on the surface of the soil. The concentrations were very low and the resulting air doses, they are small and insignificant. AJ. Depleted uranium was not detected in the air at distances greater than 100 meters from the contaminated areas. The reason for this may be limited of detection instruments. B. Contamination of the air and some surfaces with depleted uranium was found inside 2 buildings at the 2 locations mentioned above. The reason for this may be another suspension. Depletion of depleted uranium by wind or human activities from that, aka contamination, corroded radioactive grains or parts lying on the surface of the ground and buildings, as well as depleted uranium dust that has remained in the building since the time of the attack. Although the low measured levels result in doses that are small and insignificant. However, UNEP considers that exposure to such a source is unnecessary. So, I recommend it. Precautionary measures are taken. Removal of contaminated parts. 10. Raising awareness. Throughout the mission, the UNEP team observed that workers and civilians who have access to these sites, as well as military and demining personnel, are unaware of or misunderstand the risks and, more generally, the issues related to depleted uranium munitions. 11. Methodology. The techniques, equipment and methodologies used worked very well during the mission and experience. During previous missions contributed to successful assessments. 56. Post-conflict environmental assessment. 12. Protection from air and radiation safety. Only recently was the air safety infrastructure established in Bosnia and Herzegovina. INJA. In the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Parliament in 1999 approved the new law on radiation protection and radiation safety, which laid the foundation for a new regulatory system. In 2001, the Republika Srpska adopted legislation in accordance with international IAEA standards regarding protection against ionizing air. INJA. Efforts and others in order to establish an institutional framework for air protection. Changes in Bosnia and Herzegovina since the end of the conflict deserve praise, given their limitations. The resources available and the encouraging results that have been achieved, although more work is needed to improve air protection. INJA. B. In addition to 2 independent legal frameworks for air protection, 2 separate regulatory bodies and organizations for air protection were established in the Federation and Republika Srpska. INJA. This results in duplication of services and activities, which is necessary. Completely unsuitable given the lack of available funds. Lack of cooperation between 2 organizations dealing with air protection has a negative impact on the establishment and implementation of an effective radiation safety regime in Bosnia and Herzegovina. C. The repository for low-level radioactive waste in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina represents an adequate facility for the safe storage of radioactive waste in that territory, including wastes and remnants of depleted uranium. Work on the construction of a facility for the processing and storage of radioactive waste has begun. But in the last year it has not been on. Someone else knows. Ian Pomack. This facility will enhance the Air Defense Center's capability to store radioactive waste. Unfortunately, no disposal site for low-level radioactive waste is functioning in the Republic of Srpska, although in other progress towards finding a possible location where such a landfill could be built. D. Before the war, a significant number of radioactive sources were used in Bosnia and Herzegovina, such as industrial sources, lightning rods and reports. And a half-acre. Records about them are no longer available. Many of these sources are outdated, or were lost or damaged during the war and have not yet been found. The danger of potential exposure to these sources is significantly greater than exposure to the remains of depleted uranium. Consideration should be given to the storage and subsequent disposal of these sources, and in particular to the recovery and safe storage or disposal of such sources that were lost or damaged during the war. Although killed, effective control of the environment is not one of the most important priorities for B where there is no knowledge of sources of radioactivity from facilities. It is worrisome that no activities are carried out to ensure the protection of the population in areas to which they have access, and where there is radiation and/or danger of contamination. This especially applies to those areas where there are damaged or abandoned and uncontrolled sources, which is a consequence of war conflicts. 13. Health-related issues. Due to the lack of properly maintained cancer records and reporting systems, claims about an increase in the rate of negative health effects caused by depleted uranium cannot be substantiated. Conclude. It is encouraging that the B authorities have implementation of the registration system and reporting systems to detect and report cancer cases in the country. This should enable the determination of the veracity of claims regarding changes in incidence of cancer. No. Neither the data on uranium and the health effects of depleted uranium obtained over the past 50 years and the very low exposures identified during this UNEP mission indicate that there is a very low probability that depleted uranium can affect any and be associated with these reported human health consequences. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 57. 5. 14. Box with depleted uranium. One of the tasks of UNEP was to investigate the history and location of the box with grains of depleted uranium, fragments, casings and ore, which was originally located in a former tank repair facility in Hajduk, see Chapter 7.1. Based on the NATO facts dated December 3, 2002, the box with the collected depleted uranium material was transferred to the spring of 2001 to a U.S. national facility outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina for disposal. 15. Heavy metals. High contamination of the soil surface with heavy metals was measured at 3 investigated locations: a facility for the production of ammunition in Vogoska, locations for the destruction of ammunition in Kalinovic and on the plateau in Bielaznovka. Such contamination could be hazardous to health in the future. Since the values for certain elements in the land that require intervention have been reached, additional research must be carried out in order to properly assess the situation. 58. 58 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Recommendations. 1. Measure contamination and detect possible DU. At all sites in B where DU is used, the appropriate authorities should undertake investigations using field measurement equipment suitable for I. Making complementary searches for possible local ground contamination of significance, and 2. Detecting the presence of penetrators, jackets, casings and contamination points on the ground surface. At the same time, the feasibility of any necessary cleanup and decontamination measures should be assessed. 2. Decontaminate contamination points. All contamination points, including those marked by UNEP and those which may be found in the future, both indoors and outdoors, should be cleaned from loose dew and covered with asphalt, concrete or clean soil depending on the ground surface. The sites should be properly documented for possible future activities. 3. Handle and dispose of DU material properly. If any penetrators, fragments or jackets are found in the future, the following steps are recommended. The location of all found penetrators should be properly documented. Any such material should be collected by authorized personnel. Once collected, they should be safely stored as decided by responsible authorities. Proper disposal methods should be developed. 4. Keep records on the DU sites. There are reasons to believe that many penetrators remain buried deep in the ground at DU-affected sites. It is recommended to the BIH authorities that adequate documentation be kept on each site to inform local populations of the presence of DU at these sites, thereby minimizing any risks in the future, for example from any rebuilding activities that occur at the sites. This documentation should include specific site information concerning due. 5. Appropriate planning prior to any soil disturbance. Planning for any future soil disturbance or removal of vegetation should consider the risk of dew dispersion in air and inhalation of dew dust. In addition, the potential for subsequent contamination of land from corroded penetrators should be taken into account. Buried penetrators brought up to the surface and any newly discovered contamination points should be cleaned and/or removed and disposed of safely, as determined by the relevant competent authorities. As a result, appropriate contingency plans should be developed prior to groundbreaking activities when working at sites where dew weapons have been used. 6. Clean the contaminated buildings. To reduce the risk of resuspension of dew dust inside contaminated buildings, either vacuum cleaning techniques, with high-quality filters that help contain any dew particles collected, or wet cleaning methods should be used in cleaning the interior of such buildings. 7. Test the drinking water yearly. Where the presence of dew at a site was confirmed by penetrators, soil or water contamination, sampling and measurements on water at or from the site should be made annually if that water is used for drinking purposes. The same applies to any areas which may source their water or be located in the direction of groundwater flow from a contaminated area. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 59. 6. 8. Avoid contaminated water. If tests show that there is dew contamination in the water, for precautionary reasons, other water sources should be used to supply drinking water. 9. Do not transport dew to ammunition destruction sites. The destruction of ammunition by explosives should not include any dew ammunition or dew contaminated material, otherwise secondary contamination may occur in the form of dew fragments or dust. 10. Implement the site-specific recommendations. The site-specific recommendations contained in Chapter 7 of this report should be implemented without delay at the discretion of the relevant and competent authorities. 11. Release the missing dew coordinates. Dew decontamination and protection of the civilian population can only be done when the precise coordinates of a dew attack are known. The longer time elapses since the time of the attack, the more difficult it is to implement countermeasures, including decontamination. As 6 NATO dew attack coordinates in the vicinity of Sarajevo are still missing, these should be disclosed to the BiH authorities without delay. 12. More scientific work needed. Further scientific work should be carried out to reduce the scientific uncertainties related to the assessment of the environmental impact of dew. This particularly concerns corrosion of dew, dispersion in the ground, uptake by groundwater or drinking water, resuspension and dispersion in air, and possible sources of dew in vegetation. 13. Inform the civilian population and military and mine-clearing personnel. The responsible authorities should consider awareness-raising activities for the local population in general and both military and mine clearance personnel in particular. A flyer or leaflet, such as that already existing for mine safety, could be produced and distributed. This should include information about dew in general, associated risks, handling and storage, and contact information for relevant authorities. 14. Train experts for dew decontamination. The responsible authorities should develop a training course for designated personnel to act as authorized persons in the field of dew mitigation. Such a course would ideally include cleanup measures. 15. Investigate all health claims. The relevant health authorities should continue the development of a cancer reporting system and registry and investigate claims of health effects from exposure to depleted uranium in order to determine if any increased incidences of health issues exist. 16. Develop descriptive and analytical epidemiological studies. All claims regarding health deterioration allegedly caused by exposure to dew should be addressed by the relevant health authorities. This can be facilitated by developing descriptive epidemiological studies to respond to questions of changes in frequency and distribution of cancers in the population. developing analytical epidemiological studies to investigate the potential contribution of risk factors including environmental risks and dew exposure, as well as other risk factors, to specific types of cancer. 17. Develop health cooperation between the Federation of Bihun Republika Srpska. The relevant authorities within the Bihun Republika Srpska should cooperate further. 60. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Recommendations. To facilitate the development of the activities between medical researchers, population offices and cancer registries, as exchange of information is likely to be necessary to achieve the above goals. Furthermore, studies of rare cancers generally could benefit from case studies in the Bihun Republika Srpska. 18. Strengthen the radiation safety authorities. The radiation safety infrastructure for the whole of Bihun needs to be strengthened. The support provided by the IAEA, through the program of the Technical Cooperation Department, should help to ensure that this is achieved. 19. Improve radiation safety cooperation between Bihun Republika Srpska. The existence of two distinct separate infrastructures and lack of cooperation between the two radiation protection organizations in the Bihun Republika Srpska are causes of concern. A closer collaboration between the two organizations responsible for radiation safety would be welcome, as it would be beneficial to the establishment and implementation of an efficient radiation safety regime in the whole of Bihun. Efforts should be made at the international level to foster this collaboration. 20. Build facilities for radioactive waste treatment and storing. The Bihun Republika Srpska authorities should be encouraged in their efforts to build new, or complete ongoing, radioactive waste treatment and storage facilities. Support for these activities could be provided by the IAEA through its Technical Cooperation Program. 21. Mitigation of all radioactive waste. Storage of depleted uranium residues in Bihun should be dealt with within the wider context of the safe disposal of radioactive waste in the country. The authorities of the Bihun Republika Srpska should also record, safely store and eventually dispose of the large number of obsolete radioactive sources, such as industrial sources, lightning rods and smoke detectors present on the territory of Bihun, and in particular those which were damaged during the war. The risks from potential exposure to these sources are significantly higher than those from exposure to depleted uranium residues. 22. Monitor the targeted sites for radioactivity. Monitoring of radiation and radioactive contamination in areas affected by the war should be addressed by the authorities in Bihun, with particular attention, in view of the risk of potential exposures, to the different sources mentioned above, including depleted uranium. 23. Use proper measures to avoid heavy metal contamination. Sites where soil contamination by heavy metals was measured, the following recommendations could apply. Further chemical analyses, including of soil, rainwater runoff and groundwater, should be undertaken in order to gain a more complete picture of heavy metal contamination. The sites should be properly documented. Safety measures should be considered, such as fencing off ammunition destruction sites, in order to prevent civilian access. Grazing of farm animals should be prevented on these sites. 24. Investigate other regions where dew has been used. Scientific work should also be conducted in other post-conflict areas where dew has been used. To fully understand how dew behaves in the natural environment, areas with climatic conditions and soil composition other than those which occur in the Balkans region should also be investigated. UNEP, IAEA and WHO should continue to address this issue jointly. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 61. 6. Recommendations. 1. Measure contamination and detect possible depleted uranium at all locations in Bihun where depleted uranium has been used. Competent authorities should undertake a survey using field measurement equipment that is adequate for a. Complementary searches for possible significant local contamination land, and b. Detecting the presence of radioactive grains, casings, or and that, aka contamination of the surface layer of the soil. At the same time, the feasibility of all necessary measures for plucking and decontamination. 2. Decontaminate that. Contamination all that. Contamination, INCO. Because those that were whitewashed by the UNEP team and those that may be found in the future, both inside the buildings and outside, should be torn from bulk depleted uranium and covered with asphalt, concrete or with the same soil depending on the soil surface. These places should be properly recorded for possible future activities. 3. Properly handle and dispose of depleted uranium material. If new radioactive grains, fragments or shells are found in the future, it is recommended the following steps are taken. Locations of all found radioactive grains should be properly documented. All such material should be collected by authorized personnel. Once collected, this material should be stored safely, in accordance with by the decision of the competent local authorities. Proper methods of disposal of such material should be developed. 4. Keep records of depleted uranium sites. There are reasons to believe that many radioactive grains remain buried deep in the ground at depleted uranium sites. I recommend it. It is assumed that the BIH authorities keep adequate documentation on each such location so that the local population is informed about the presence of depleted uranium at those locations. In order to minimize risks in the future, for example during construction works at those locations, that documentation should also contain information about depleted uranium at that specific location. 5. Prepare appropriate plans before earth-moving. Planning for any earth-moving or vegetation removal in the future should take into account the risk of airborne release of depleted uranium and inhalation of depleted uranium dust. Also, the possibility of later soil contamination with corroded radioactive grains should be taken into account. Buried radioactive grains that were brought to the surface and all newly found ones. Contaminations should be safely torn, removed and disposed of in accordance with the decision of the relevant competent authorities. That is why adequate alternative plans should be developed before the start of earth-moving activities during work at locations where depleted uranium weapons were used. 6. Clean up contaminated buildings in order to reduce the risk of resuspension of depleted uranium dust in contaminated buildings. 4. The interior of such buildings should 62. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Recommendations. Use or vacuum technology. And with high-quality filters that keep everything. Depleted uranium or wet methods. The tiers. 7. Annually test the water for PCAs in locations where the use of depleted uranium has been confirmed by the presence of radioactive grains, contamination of water or land by the UNEP mission. Once a year sampling and measurement of the water at that location or the water that arrives. Even if that water is intended for drinking water. This is recommended. Hear and listen. Of all areas whose source of water is located in a contaminated area, or which are located in the direction of the flow of groundwater coming from contaminated areas. 8. Avoid contaminated water if the tests show that the water is contaminated with depleted uranium. Other sources of drinking water should be used as a precaution. 9. Do not take depleted uranium to places where ammunition is destroyed. When destroying ammunition by explosion, it should not contain any depleted uranium ammunition or material contaminated with depleted uranium, because it can lead to secondary contamination in the form of debris or dust with depleted uranium. 10. Implement recommendations for specific locations. Recommendations for specific locations found in Chapter 7 of this report should be implemented without delay as decided by the relevant competent authorities. 11. Publish the coordinates of Ta, aka in which depleted uranium was used. Missing the process of decontamination of the area from depleted uranium and the protection of the civilian population can only be carried out if the coordinates of the attack with depleted uranium weapons are known. The more time passes from the time of the attack, the harder countermeasures will be implemented. Uki decontamination. Since the NATO coordinates for the 6 locations that were attacked with depleted uranium are still missing, The BiH authorities should be informed of these coordinates without delay. 12. Conduct additional science. Nor work additional science. Nor work should be carried out to reduce science. Not unclear related to the assessment of the impact of depleted uranium on the environment. This especially applies to the corrosion of depleted uranium, spreading in the ground, absorption in groundwater and re-elevation and dispersion in the air, as well as possible sources of depleted uranium in vegetation. 13. Inform the civilian population, military personnel and mine clearance personnel. The local authorities should consider awareness-raising activities for the local population in general, and especially for military personnel and mine clearance personnel. A leaflet or pamphlet such as the existing one on mine safety could be prepared and distributed. It would contain general information about depleted uranium, the risks it brings, etc. in handling and storage, and information on the in contacting the competent authorities. 14. OBU. GO-STR. Staff for decontamination from depleted uranium. The competent authorities should develop a training course for selected personnel, who would be authorized to mitigate the consequences of depleted uranium. Such a course would ideally serve Adjuncl. Evaluate and measures the tiers. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 63. 6. 15. Investigate all claims about the health consequences of depleted uranium. National health authorities should continue to develop a system for reporting and recording cancer cases and investigate all claims related to the health consequences of exposure to depleted uranium in order to establish whether there is an increase in of health problems. 16. Develop descriptive and analytics. Epidemiological studies should be reviewed by the relevant health authorities. All claims related to health deterioration allegedly caused by exposure to depleted uranium. This can be facilitated by development of descriptive epidemiological studies to answer the questions of changes in stability and geographical distribution of cancer in the population. Development of analytes of epidemiological studies to investigate the potential contribution of risk factors, including high risk to the environment, and the contribution of exposure to depleted uranium, as well as other risk factors, to the occurrence of certain types of cancer. 17. Develop cooperation in the field of health between the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska. The relevant authorities in the Federation and Republika Srpska should further cooperate in order to facilitate the development of the above-mentioned activities between medical institutions. Extras, which would also serve as a registrar of persons suffering from cancer, since it will probably be necessary to exchange information in order to achieve the above-mentioned goals. Moreover, studies of rare forms of cancer may require research. Listening. In the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republic of Srpska in order to be able to find an answer to the question of the study. 18. Consolidate authorities dealing with radiation safety and radiation safety infrastructure in the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Support provided by the IAEA through the program of the Department of Technical Towards Cooperation should be provided by me. Development of the National Radiation Safety Infrastructure. 19. To improve cooperation between the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republic of Srpska in the field of radiation security. The existence of two separate infrastructures and the lack of cooperation between the two organizations for air protection developments in the Federation and Republika Srpska cause concern. Closer cooperation between two organizations responsible for air protection changes would be welcome, as they would contribute to the establishment and implementation of an effective air protection regime. Events throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina. Efforts should be made at the international level to encourage this cooperation. 20. Build facilities for the processing and storage of radioactive waste. The authorities of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republic of Srpska should be encouraged in their efforts to build new or complete existing facilities for the processing and storage of radioactive waste. Support for these activities could also be provided by the IAEA through its technical program. To cooperation. 21. Remediate all radioactive waste. Storage of depleted uranium remains in Bosnia and Herzegovina should be carried out in the wider context of safe disposal of radioactive waste in the country. The authorities of the Federation and Republika Srpska should also keep records, secure storage and, at some point, dispose of a large number of outdated sources of radioactivity, such as industrial sources, lightning rods, and report. An acre present on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially those that were damaged during the war. The risk of potential exposure to these radioactive sources is significantly greater than the risk of exposure to the remains of depleted uranium. 64. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Recommendations. 22. Carry out monitoring of the affected locations for the purpose of PT. Monitoring of radioactivity. The B authorities should monitor radiation and radioactive contamination in war-affected areas with particular attention to the danger of possible exposure to the various radioactive sources described above, including highly depleted uranium. 23. Apply proper methods to avoid contamination with heavy metals. The following recommendations refer to locations where soil contamination with heavy metals has been measured. Undertake additional chemical analyses, by analyzing soil, runoff and groundwater, in order to get a more complete picture of heavy metal contamination in such locations. Keep proper documentation about those locations. Consider security measures, such as fencing off destruction sites. Ammunition, in order to stop and civilian access to those locations. SBR. To graze domestic animals in those locations. 24. Istria and other regions where depleted uranium no is used. Nor should work be carried out in other post-conflict areas where depleted uranium has been used. In order to fully understand the behavior of depleted uranium in the environment, areas where climatic conditions and soil composition differ from those in the Balkans should be investigated. UNEP, IAEA and WHO should continue to work together on this issue. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 65. 7. Site-specific findings. Detailed results of the sample findings mentioned in this chapter for soil, water, botanical, beta, air, penetrators, special studies and heavy metals can be found respectively in appendices D, E, F, G, H, I, J and K. Complete investigation and sampling techniques are discussed in Appendix C. Methodology and quality control. Lichen samples, identified in this chapter by an asterisk, were subdivided into single-species subsamples. All subsamples had the same number as the original samples but with an additional letter. The same applies to all lichen samples taken during the mission at various sites. 7.1 Hadzici Tank Repair Facility, 14 October 15, 2002. Nadaref. Number 9, Number 14, Number 15. Coordinates. 34 TBP 74,100, 56,950. Target. 2 large hard surface yards where a large number of tanks and vehicles were located at the time of attack, as well as the large buildings near the central yard where tank repair activities took place. Date of attack. 5 and September 9, 1995. Number of rounds. 1,500. Area. Large, fenced area with mine warnings around the perimeter. The site has limited access privileges to those working within the local businesses that are presently located within the complex, lumber, storage, car repair, etc. Investigated surface area, 325 meters by 850 meters. Town/population. Hadzi municipality currently has a mostly Muslim population of about 2,660 inhabitants. Detached and multi-family houses and flats surround the targeted site. A few hundred people live in the immediate vicinity. Other information. The former Hadzi tank repair facility is approximately 1 kilometer from the center of Hadzi town. It was once a large operating facility with a number of buildings of various sizes, most of which were partly destroyed at the time of attack. Site description and general information. The former Hadzi tank repair facility is situated in an east-west oriented valley. The site is fenced and has limited access privileges, but the area outside of the fence has unlimited public access. Inside the facility area are numerous small and large workshops, storage barns and buildings. Most of these were bombed during the war, and some totally destroyed, with only concrete pads now left. Many of the remaining buildings are still partly destroyed. Repairs are ongoing and several of the bombed buildings are now used as workshops or storage areas. The western part of the facility was the main target for A-10 attacks with DU ammunition. Penetrators hit tanks and vehicles which were parked in the open yards, and also hit a number of the workshops and buildings. A large portion of the facility contains hard surfaces such as asphalt, concrete or basalt cobblestones. These surfaces aid rainwater to discharge into a small canalized stream that runs through the facility. Although surface rainwater runoff is probably discharged into the stream, this is unlikely to be the case for the area's groundwater. Although the drainage direction for groundwater is uncertain, it is probably from the sides of the valley towards the stream. Thus, any potential contamination of stream water by DU would have occurred after the attack and may still be continuing. 66. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Site-specific findings. An overview of the Hadzi tank repair facility from a neighboring home. The ground consists of clayey soil. There is no exposed rock in the area and the soil layer is believed to be several meters thick. The whole area surrounding the facility was mined during the conflict to prevent access. The mines and unexploded ammunition are only partly cleared. During the pre-mission, repeated references were made both by SFAR and locals on the site about the existence of a box containing loose DU ammunition, including penetrators, fragments and jackets, casings. The box was studied in detail by a German SFAR troop who had visited the site previously, and it had since been removed from the site. In January 2001, pictures of that very box were published worldwide by the press in articles related to the issue of DU in the Balkans. The history of this box was difficult to follow, especially with regard to its current location. It is discussed in further detail at the end of this chapter. Field investigation. Due to mines and the risk of unexploded ordnance, all investigations were restricted to hard surface areas. Exceptions included small grassy areas and buildings that the Bahrain Action Center declared safe. Within the fenced site, most of the surface area and 2 buildings were searched by online survey. This method is described in Appendix C. Random surveys were done over some of the grassy areas and within a few additional buildings. No search for DU contamination was performed outside the fenced perimeter. Special attention was given to the cobblestone lot and the large concrete yard where tanks were positioned during the attack. 1 penetrator was collected for detailed analysis. There were also indications from field measurements of a large number of penetrators hidden in the ground, contamination points. Importantly, some may have spread over larger, inaccessible areas within the minefields or have been collected at an earlier date. Samples taken included 1 penetrator, 10 surface soil samples to a depth of 5 cm, 2 surface, grab samples, 4 water samples, 1 well, 2 stream, 1 tap. 7 bioindicators, 3 lichen, 2 moss, 2 bark/lichen. 2 vegetable samples, cabbage, 9 air filter samples. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 67. 7. Hadzi tank repair facility. 56 656 404 856 200. SB. S. AS. A. In this area, 160 contamination points were found. SSA. A. BA. In this area, 73 contamination points were found. S. B. SLK A. SA. W. 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 S. B. A. Penetrator, fragment. Contamination point. S. Surface soil sample. W. Water sample. B. Botanical sample. A. Air filter position. Border of minefield. Area searched by random survey. Area searched by online survey. Green area. Area with many contamination points. Building. Lighting rod with radioactive source. 37 special studies of endpoints not included in the map. S. W. Banja Luka Sarajevo. B. SB. BS. 273 800. 0. 100. 74000. 200 meters. S74 200. 74 400 grid, UTM 34 TBP. 68. 68 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Site-specific findings. Findings. 69 contamination points were found in the site's central cobblestone yard. General contamination. In spite of the large number of DU rounds used, there was no detectable widespread surface contamination, either with field measurements or with soil sample measurements. Localized surface contamination was identified in 2 areas. However, there were a large number of contamination points and penetrators on or hidden beneath the surface. Measurements of radiation. Conditions for detecting contamination, penetrators and fragments were favorable. During investigations with both online and random surveys, the total gamma and beta radiation was continuously measured by the SRAT and inspector instruments. For methodology information, see Appendix C. The background gamma radiation on hard surface areas was 0.020.04 micros/H and on soil 0.03 to 0.05 micros/H. Beta radiation background was 0.1 CPS. This represents very low gamma and beta radiation. Enhanced gamma radiation was encountered at 2 locations, with radiation levels at 0.05 to 0.15 micros/H. The radiation was emitted from 2 lightning rods on the roofs of buildings, one of which appeared to be damaged. These rods were equipped with radioactive sources used for the ionization of surrounding air in order to attract lightning. Special studies of possible contamination of DU by measurements of gamma and beta radiation on metal, concrete and wood surfaces were carried out at 34 locations, see Appendix J. Penetrators, jackets and localized points of contamination. During the investigation the team found 233 points with increased radiation caused either by contamination from DU dust formed at the time of impact, fragments or hole penetrators on, close to or under the ground surface. Increased radiation, sharp S+ or just comma was located to contamination points, usually not larger than 10 to 50 centimeters in diameter. Radiation levels were usually in the range of 10 times normal background, but could also be found as high as depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 69. 7. 100 times normal background. All contamination points located were marked by a circle of red paint. Widespread contamination was not encountered. 69 contamination points were found in the cobblestone yard near the large workshops in the western part of the facility. A further 160 points were located on the concrete field lot in the northwest corner, see map. 3 contamination points were also found inside a workshop building, and only 1 contamination point was found in soil. No contamination points were found in the eastern part of the facility. To a large extent, the penetrators that hit the concrete and cobblestone areas are still lying on or just below the hard surfaces, making it favorable to find them. Certainly, Many of the penetrators that were fired also hit soft ground and remain in the soil. Both 160 contamination points were found on inside and outside the fenced area. It is expected this large concrete surface in the sites that many penetrators and fragments could be found northwest corner in the soil, although in many cases penetrators will have entered so deeply into the ground as to be undetectable even by gamma-sensitive instruments used during the mission. However, few measurements were possible there, and no measurements were made on the railway track that leads into the center of the concrete yard. Prior to leaving the area, UNEP collected penetrators and fragments lying openly on the ground as they represented a potential health risk or they to be picked up by people working on the site. Contaminated soil, as well as full penetrators and fragments that were buried in the ground, were left to be removed by authorized personnel during later decontamination activities. Soil. Dew in surface soil was only found close to impact points. Local dew dispersion could be measured at a distance up to a few meters from penetrator impact points. Beyond a distance of 50 to 100 meters, no indications of widespread dew contamination could be found. In order to define the topsoil concentration of local dew contamination and the approximate magnitude of the contaminated surface, 12 surface soil samples were collected from different locations both within and outside the fenced area. Sampling sites were selected just outside of the immediate vicinity, 1 to 2 meters, of visible impact points in order to more accurately measure any local contamination. 6 samples were taken inside the fenced area where many impact points were identified. A further 6 samples were taken outside the fenced area, where no indications of penetrators or impact points could be found. Samples were taken both inside and outside the fenced facility area. Inside the facility, only one topsoil sample, Nuke 20020240008, had measurable local dew contamination of 0.2 mg/kg of soil. This value is equivalent to only about 10% of the average natural uranium concentration in soil. The sample was collected on a grass surface at a distance of about 5 to 10 meters. 70 Post-conflict environmental assessment. Site-specific findings. To the nearest confirmed penetrator impact point, situated on the edge of a hard surface, concrete, asphalt. At the edge of the large cobblestone yard near the center of the facility, 2 sand samples, Nuke 20020240011 and Nuke 20020240012, were collected where rainwater runoff had deposited a 3 cm layer of sand and dust. In this yard, and within a distance of about 50 meters, many penetrator impact points were identified. Dew concentration in these 2 samples was 11 and 30 mg/kg, equivalent to roughly 10 times the natural uranium concentration in soil. These samples certainly included some material and residues collected directly from the penetrator shot holes as they are known to contain much higher levels of local dew contamination. No indication of dew contamination exceeding the detection limit could be found in any of the samples taken outside the fenced area. Natural uranium concentration in these samples was in the range of 2.8 to 4.7 mg/kg of soil, which is in the normal range of natural uranium concentration in soil. The measured isotopic composition of the uranium was indicative of natural uranium. Water samples. 4 water samples were collected, APOT BHW01 to BHW04. The first was taken from a concrete drainage well close to the bank of the small stream that crosses the site. The second was collected directly from the stream. A third was a well water sample taken near the office buildings. This water is used for cooking purposes once it has been boiled. The last sample was taken from a concrete drainage well on the eastern side of the facility. This water is also used for drinking and cooking. The 234U/238U and 235U/238U ratios show dew contamination in one of the well water samples, BHW03. Mass spectrometric data also indicated contamination in the other well water sample, BHW01. It should be noted that although the measured uranium values in all samples collected at this site are higher than other water samples collected in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the corresponding radiation doses are lower than 0.1 microsieverts per year and are therefore insignificant. Botanical samples. 4 lichen and 2 moss samples were taken inside the fenced area. The first lichen sample, APOT-BH01A, was collected together with tree bark, probably Acer sp, due to the very small size of the lichen. Moss was also taken on the same tree, APOT-BH01B. The second moss sample, APOT-BH04, was taken on the soil and showed the presence of dew particles. This confirms the earlier presence of dew in the air. Several penetrators, 1 jacket and a large number collecting a bark and lichen sample and hatsisi of fragments were also found in this area. However, as the sample lay on soil and it is difficult to clean all soil from such samples, it is likely that there was a contribution of soil particles to the activity found in the sample. The remaining lichen samples, APOT-BH02A, B, C, APOT-BH03A, APOT-BH05, were collected around the site. The presence of dew in all but sample APOT-BH02A indicates the earlier presence of dew in the air, which means that at least some of the penetrators hit hard surfaces, split into dust and dispersed into the air. It is also an indication of possible resuspension of dew from ground contamination. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 71. 7. Botanical samples, APOT-BH06A, APOT-BH06B and APOT-BH07, were collected from a private garden outside the site. No presence of dew could be detected. In addition, 2 vegetable samples, VUBS1, VUBS2, were collected for uranium isotopic determination. However, results from these 2 cabbage samples were insufficient to allow for any scientific conclusion. See Appendix F. There are no reasons to expect any dew to occur in food due to the low dispersion rate in the ground and the low uptake factor in food. Air samples. 4 air samples were taken during the first day and 5 during the second day. The first day's samples were taken at random in order to estimate the average uranium concentration within the entire facility's premises. See map. During the second day, 2 air samplers were placed inside buildings close to the large cobblestone yard with many contamination points in order to ascertain any possible risk to employees currently working on the site. The 3 remaining samples were taken from other areas selected in order to get a complete picture of the site. Dew in air was detected in 5 of the samples, including inside a building in which contamination points were identified, in another building where no dew contamination was found with field instruments, and on the cobblestone area where numerous contamination points and penetrators were found. This was a new finding as it was the first time that contamination of air had been found in the national environment. It is necessary, however, to question whether the UNEP personnel were responsible for placing any of the dew-contaminated dust in the air by digging for penetrators or through resuspension of contaminated dust on the ground. As digging activities on the second day began only after the air samplers were shut off, the positive result from within the buildings supports the latter explanation. Further, it is important to note that any dew resuspension would occur normally through the ongoing daily activities at the site, that is resuspension would be caused in circumstances other than field investigations. Samples that were taken more than 100 meters away from attacked areas did not show any dew, nor did the filter sample taken on the first day on the cobblestone area. The uranium concentrations were in the range of 1050 picograms per m3 in all but 2 of the air samples, which represents very low level contamination of the air, and of the same order of magnitude as the natural uranium background in air. Only in 2 air samples was the uranium measured at a level of 0.41.0 nanograms per m3, which is in the upper natural background range. The air resuspension factors for this site were found in the range of 0.12.2.1, 10 to 9 meters -1. Box of dew penetrators. Neither SFAR, the workers on the site, or local authorities could provide information on the location of the dew box. The workers on site mentioned that it had been removed by SFAR in 2001. Further information is provided in section 7.16 below. Residual risks. The tank repair facility was one of the most heavily attacked areas in the region, with 1,500 rounds corresponding to roughly 450 kilograms of uranium. Of the 1,500 reported rounds, about 15% were identified during the mission based on the number of contamination points identified. The areas searched no longer have penetrators on the surface and all identified contamination points are marked with a circle of red paint. This should reduce the risk that someone might unintentionally pick up a penetrator or touch a marked contamination point and be contaminated by uranium. The risk of uranium intake and the corresponding radiation dose, less than 1 MSV, as well as heavy metal toxic effects, are small due to the relatively low concentration of uranium, about 30 milligrams of uranium, mainly due, per kg of soil, unless the penetrator is heavily corroded. Further, potential direct intake from contaminated. 72. Post-conflict environmental assessment. Site-specific findings. Hands is small. It can be higher for children than for adults, but in this instance the area is fenced and is not accessible to children. It should be mentioned that due to mines and unexploded ordnance, not all areas or buildings of the site were surveyed. Away from the searched area in unpaved parts there may still be many penetrators hidden in the ground. Some may also be on the surface, such that once the area is cleared of mines, penetrators could be picked up by someone and contaminate their hands. In this case, and with the radioactive source from lightning rods as conservative assumptions on intake, 1 gram due, another important issue to address which also assumes bad hygiene, there is a possibility of contracting radiation doses of the order of 1 millisievert, equals natural background, exceeding limits protecting against heavy metal effects. If a penetrator or fragment were placed in a pocket and kept close to the body for several weeks, there is a possibility of absorbing a radiation dose to the skin higher than the accepted level of radiation for workers in 1 year, greater than 500 millisieverts. Contamination of soil was found only at and close to the contamination points and therefore there are no foreseen future risks of widespread ground contamination. With respect to water contamination, the rate of penetrator corrosion can be relatively high depending on the chemical qualities of the surrounding soil. Complete corrosive disintegration can occur in 25-35 years. However, the solubility and, thereby, susceptibility to contamination of groundwater and subsequent drinking water is even more uncertain. In one of the wells there was a clear indication of dew contamination, and a weak indication in one of the concrete drainage wells. See Appendix C. The concentration in both was very low and insignificant from a radiological and chemical toxicological point of view. This can obviously change with time, and possible future dew contamination of well water will depend on the dissolution rate and solubility of dew in the well water uptake area. There are so many uncertain factors governing the possible contamination of water that it is impossible to predict future contamination levels. Enough is known, however, that even after 8 years there are still no problems with dew in drinking water from the radiological and chemical risk standpoint. Contamination of the superficial ground layer can also cause contamination of the air. Although dew contamination of the air could be detected in some cases, the concentrations were very low and insignificant from the point of view of radiological and heavy metal chemical risk. Nevertheless, the observations are interesting with respect to studies on the relation of ground-to-air contamination. The measurements and samples taken were unfortunately not numerous enough to make systematic studies on the possible reasons for air contamination. For instance, air contamination could depend on AC activities that were ongoing simultaneously, or dew contamination indoors, on floors and walls, could also cause air contamination. Irrespective of the reason, the observation that air contamination can still be detected 7 years after the attack occurred is important in The overall understanding of the short and long-term environmental consequences of empty shells and UXO were found at the site. Using DU in military conflicts. Depleted uranium in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 73. 7. Need for mitigation, recommendations. Site investigations revealed low-level DU results based on the measurements achieved. They represent no real risk to individuals at the site. However, as the team was not able to explore the whole site, and as a precautionary measure, the following conclusions and recommendations are proposed. 1. All penetrators and fragments that still might lie on the surface of unmined areas should be removed, with due consideration of all safety aspects in handling and storage. 2. All marked contamination points should be cleaned of loose contamination and contaminated soil. 3. Holes on hard surfaces of still hidden penetrators and non-decontaminated surfaces should be covered by new asphalt or concrete. In grassy areas these should be covered by clean soil. 4. All buildings should be searched for loose contamination, such as penetrators, fragments and DU dust, within reasonable limits of 10 grams/m2. Authorized personnel should remove any such detected contamination and these residues should be handed over to the relevant authorities for proper storage. 5. Water contamination levels on the site were found to be below stated WHO limits. However, given all the uncertainties concerning DU in the ground and possible increased contamination of drinking water in the future, it is recommended that consideration be given by the authorities to reconstructing the water pipeline which was damaged during the war in order to avoid any unnecessary future risks. Nevertheless, any present and future drinking water that might originate from the site area should be checked for possible DU contamination by sampling and measurement once a year. 6. As some buildings are currently in use and additional buildings may be put to future use, it is recommended that authorized personnel properly clean those buildings. Based on current data, such cleaning could be completed through well-filtered vacuum cleaning or wet washing methods. 7. As the UNEP sampling was limited to hard surfaces, it can be expected that a large number of penetrators remain undetected in grassy areas. Throughout future mine clearance activities, all safety aspects should be considered in the handling and storage of penetrators and fragments. In addition, the area should be searched for penetrators and contamination points and measures taken accordingly.